What do a glass-bodied French king, a hot chocolate-chugging Aztec emperor, and a British royal accidentally worshipped as a god have in common? Nothing except a title and deeply unhinged hobbies. These aren't the facts they teach you in school. These are the ones they hide behind oil paintings and polished biographies. Welcome to 53 ridiculous royal facts, where the thrones are velvet, but the stories are pure chaos. Before we dive headfirst into royal absurdity, quick pause. If you love stories that make history feel weirder than fiction, hit subscribe and join the kingdom of curious minds. Also, we're keeping royal tabs, so drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Madrid? 3 a.m. in Manila? We want to know who's staying up with us for this royal descent into madness. Alright, back to the drama. King Charles VI of France believed he was made of glass. There's fragile egos, and then there's King Charles VI of France, who took fragility to a level that would make even a porcelain doll feel emotionally stable. Charles, known affectionately and later diagnostically as Charles the Mad, genuinely believed his body was made of glass, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. Glass. He wore reinforced clothing. He refused to let people touch him. At one point, he reportedly sat completely still for hours, terrified that a single movement might cause him to shatter into 1,000,000 noble shards. And while the court doctors poked and theorized and invented increasingly ridiculous remedies including, we kid you not, rubbing him with goat fat and wrapping him in blankets, the royal court did what all royal courts do best when things get awkward. They pretended it was fine. Perfectly fine. The king believes he's a crystal goblet. Marvelous. Pour the wine. Charles wasn't alone in his glass delusion. In the 15th century, there was actually a trend among nobles suffering from glass delusion. A bizarre status plague of the fragile elite. But Charles, he was the poster child. His breakdowns became legend. He once ran through the castle swinging a sword at his own knights, thinking they were enemies, and then, a few days later, refused to move from bed because someone had brushed against his elbow and he feared he had cracked. The irony? His country was cracking far more rapidly than he was. France, during Charles's reign, descended into chaos. The 100 Years' War raged on, civil factions divided the country, and meanwhile, the king was anxiously sitting in his chambers, whispering to his advisors not to knock on the door too hard, because it might echo down his spine. But perhaps the real tragedy wasn't the king's madness, it was how the court responded. No one dared challenge the illusion, not because they believed it, but because they couldn't afford to. The throne was brittle, and everyone was pretending it wasn't. And if that's not a metaphor for monarchy, what is? Of course, royal irrationality didn't stop with thinking you were made of glass. Some monarchs simply couldn't decide what to wear, even if they owned enough outfits to clothe a kingdom. Queen Elizabeth I of England owned over 3,000 dresses, but complained she had nothing to wear. Imagine this. A woman stands before an ornate gilded mirror, surrounded by walls of embroidered silks, Venetian lace, and enough jewels to buy Belgium and sighs dramatically. I have nothing to wear. Welcome to the morning routine of Queen Elizabeth I of England, a woman whose closet was less a closet and more a fortified vault of fashion-based political warfare. Her collection reportedly included over 3,000 dresses, each more magnificent, more glittering, more absurdly starched than the last. Yet, according to her inner circle, Elizabeth would often stall entire diplomatic meetings because she was still deciding what to put on. But this wasn't vanity. Not exactly. Elizabeth understood better than anyone that clothing was power. She used her image the way generals used cavalry. Every ruff, Every gem, every stiffened sleeve was a strategic maneuver. She cultivated an aesthetic of divine untouchability, the Virgin Queen draped in iconography, bathed in pearls, her hair flame red like some Tudor Athena. She even had portraits painted to be deliberately unrealistic. Her artists were banned from depicting signs of aging. No wrinkles, no tired eyes. Elizabeth's wardrobe wasn't just fashion, it was propaganda stitched in silk. Yet, despite all this grandeur, she had one very human flaw: decision paralysis. Reports say she once made a Spanish ambassador wait 3 hours while she debated between 2 nearly identical gowns. You can picture it, ministers pacing in the hallway, time ticking, while Her Majesty anguishes over a shade of gold. She also demanded exclusivity. No one else at court was allowed to wear certain colours if she had claimed them. One lady in waiting dared to wear a dress similar to hers at a ball. She was dismissed immediately. Not exiled, not imprisoned, just fashionably erased. So when Elizabeth sighed that she had nothing to wear, she wasn't being flippant. She was expressing the pressure of ruling through fabric, managing an empire by corset. You see, when you rule alone, unmarried, childless, endlessly watched, the only thing you can control is how the world sees you. And Elizabeth made sure they saw nothing but myth. Still, not all monarchs had such calculated control. Some just said whatever they wanted in 5 languages and hoped the world kept up. And while Elizabeth fretted over ruffs and rubies, Charles V was busy assigning languages to everyone from God to his horse. By the way, if you're still here, you're clearly one of us, so go ahead and subscribe for more history that refuses to behave. Also, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Is this your 2 a.m. rabbit hole? Your lunch break in Lisbon? We're collecting time zones like royal scandals. Now, speaking of conversations with trees, Emperor Charles V spoke so many languages. He joked, "I speak Spanish to God, Italian to women, French to men, and German to my horse." Emperor Charles V had 1 crown too many. Or maybe 12. Born in Ghent, raised in Burgundy, crowned King of Spain, then Holy Roman Emperor, he spent most of his life being simultaneously royal in countries he barely understood and speaking in tongues more than a Pentecostal convention. Charles didn't just dabble in languages, he mastered them. Fluent in Latin, Spanish, French, German, Italian, and reportedly passable in Dutch, he became a polyglot, not for fun, but out of sheer necessity. His empire was so sprawling it needed translators just to understand its own laws. He was Europe's most powerful man, and probably its most confused, which is why his most famous quote reads like the setup to a royal stand-up routine. "I speak Spanish to God, Italian to women, French to men, and German to my horse." Dry, regal, possibly apocryphal, but totally believable. Spanish was the language of prayer, lofty, precise, majestic. Italian was sensual, poetic, perfect for courtship. French, of course, the language of diplomacy, manners, and passive aggression. And German? Well, have you heard German? Charles spoke it to his horse, probably while giving it legal documents to sign. But behind the charm of the quote lies a deeper tension. Charles ruled a continent too large for any one man to understand. He was a patchwork emperor in a patchwork empire, whose control relied less on power and more on persuasion. Language wasn't just communication, it was survival. He spent more time traveling than reigning, more time writing letters than winning wars. By the time he retired to a monastery in Spain, exhausted, diseased, and slowly going deaf, he left behind an empire splintering under its own weight and a Europe that would soon implode. Still, one has to admire the effort. He may have spoken to God in Spanish, but it's what he didn't say to his enemies that kept him alive. And if Charles V was the linguist emperor, his distant British cousin would be the complete opposite. So confused, in fact, that he once tried to shake hands with a tree. King George III of Britain tried to shake hands with a tree, thinking it was the King of Prussia. By the time King George III of Britain started greeting trees like foreign dignitaries, most of his courtiers had mastered the royal art of awkwardly pretending everything was fine. After all, monarchs misbehaving wasn't new, but George III didn't just misbehave. He misfired, repeatedly, publicly, and often botanically. The tree incident became the stuff of whispered legend. During one of his infamous mental health episodes, possibly linked to porphyria, though historians still bicker about the cause, George walked into the palace gardens, made direct eye contact with a chestnut tree, and earnestly offered his hand, welcoming the King of Prussia with all the gravitas of a diplomatic summit. What kind of tree was it? We don't know. The sources are fuzzy. But you can imagine the scene. George, in his full regalia, bowing slightly, extending a white-gloved hand, addressing a silent, leafy monarch with dignity and warmth. And the tree, to its credit, held its composure. This moment wasn't isolated. George III's reign was riddled with episodes of mental collapse, bursts of manic energy, and confusing speeches that baffled Parliament. He reportedly talked for hours without stopping, wrote letters with no punctuation, and occasionally foamed at the mouth while insisting he could speak to angels. Whether it was madness or mercury poisoning, what's clear is this. The man who once lost America was slowly losing something far more personal, his own sense of reality. And yet, even at his most incoherent, George was never fully abandoned. Parliament didn't depose him, they simply introduced a regency. His son, who would eventually become George IV, and was arguably even worse in different ways, stepped in to manage affairs while Papa communed with shrubbery. Because in Britain, even when your king starts mistaking foliage for foreign royalty, you still respect the chain of command. What makes George's story so unsettling isn't the absurdity, it's the humanity. This wasn't a tyrant being dramatic or a royal indulging in costume-based delusions. It was a man, a father, a husband, a ruler breaking under the weight of an empire and his own brain chemistry. And while the image of him shaking hands with a tree makes for an excellent historical meme, it also quietly aches. The irony, of course, is that George's nickname was Farmer George, earned during his earlier, saner years for his interest in agriculture. So maybe, in some backwards poetic twist, he really was just checking on the crops. Speaking of surreal deathbed scenes, wait until you meet the Queen who took her dog to her own execution. Mary, Queen of Scots, kept a small lapdog hidden under her skirts even during her execution. If you ever feel like your emotional support animal is a bit too attached, spare a thought for Mary, Queen of Scots, who quite literally took hers to the grave. Mary Stuart's life was one of relentless drama. Exiled as a child, crowned as a teen, married 3 times, imprisoned for nearly 2 decades, and eventually executed by her cousin's order, Elizabeth I. Because royal family reunions are always that awkward. But amid all the plots and poisonings and palace coups, Mary held on to one constant, her tiny Skye Terrier. The dog, unnamed in most accounts because apparently nobody bothered asking, followed her everywhere. And we do mean everywhere. When she was imprisoned in Fotheringhay Castle, the dog stayed curled beneath her long skirts like a breathing foot warmer. When she was led to the scaffold in front of the shocked eyes of guards and nobles alike, the dog was still there, trembling, silent, unseen. And when she knelt for the blade, it remained hidden in the folds of her gown. It wasn't until after the executioner had done his work twice, badly, which we will not describe, that someone noticed the blood-spattered dog crawling out from under her crumpled dress, confused, whimpering, refusing to leave her side. Now, imagine you're a court official, tasked with cleaning up after a beheaded queen, and suddenly there's a small, loyal dog refusing to let go. History doesn't often mention him. No paintings, no royal burial, just a footnote of unshakable loyalty buried beneath centuries of political gossip. Mary's life was a mess of intrigue and betrayal. She was accused of plotting to kill her husband, then possibly complicit in his murder, then entangled in a web of Catholic conspiracies that spooked Protestant England into locking her away. But none of that mattered to the dog. In a world where everyone had an agenda, her lapdog had only one: her. The symbolism is almost too on the nose. A royal surrounded by power-hungry men, failed marriages, and treacherous cousins, and the only being that stayed faithful was a dog hiding beneath her skirts. But don't worry, not all royals feared poisoners and backstabbing plots. Some just feared that their lunch had been weighed wrong. Queen Victoria had her servants weigh her food before and after she ate, to make sure no one had tampered with it. At first glance, Queen Victoria seems like the kind of monarch who wouldn't be bothered by trivia. She ruled over the largest empire in the world. Her name defined an entire era. She survived assassination attempts, childbirth, and decades of mourning after Prince Albert's death. And yet, she was paranoid about her peas. Victoria insisted that all her meals be weighed before and after she ate to ensure no one had tampered with them. The food arrived on a silver scale, was recorded in detailed logs, and then weighed again once she'd finished. If there was a discrepancy, the kitchen staff had to explain exactly why. Did a sprig of parsley fall off the plate? Account for it. Was a single berry missing? Write it down. And no, this wasn't about portion control. It was about control. Period. Victoria had lived through enough palace intrigue to know that being queen didn't just mean wearing a crown, it meant watching your back. Poison was a constant concern. Even in an age of technological marvels and stiff etiquette, the threat of a rogue servant slipping something fatal into your fig tart never really went away. But the weighing wasn't just for her safety. It was a ritual, a kind of edible accounting. Victoria treated meals like military operations, timed, measured, and closely observed. She dined in exactly 30 minutes. If her guests hadn't finished, too bad the plates were cleared. Conversations were cut short mid-sentence because the Queen had finished her pudding. It created an atmosphere of quiet terror at the royal table. Nobles would shovel down food like nervous contestants on a game show, terrified of breaking the rhythm. And kitchen staff worked with scientific precision, knowing a miscounted carrot could lead to a scolding from the throne. There's a strange comfort in knowing that even the most powerful woman in the world was haunted by invisible dangers, that beneath the crown, she was just another human being trying to stay one step ahead of the chaos. And if you think ritualized meals and scale watching are peculiar, wait until you meet a king who twirled around in tights for an audience that desperately wished he wouldn't. Louis XIV of France loved ballet so much, he danced publicly well into middle age, even when courtiers cringed. Most monarchs rule from a throne. Louis XIV of France ruled from center stage, wearing gold tights and spinning in dramatic arabesques while an orchestra played in the background. They called him the Sun King not just because of his radiant power, but because he quite literally cast himself as the sun in a self-written ballet at age 15. No metaphor here, he was the Sunday, personified, in dance, and he never stopped performing. Throughout his reign, Louis treated ballet not as a hobby, but as a divine right. His daily routine was choreographed. His movements were deliberate, theatrical. The court at Versailles became a living stage, and he its ever-rehearsing lead. And like any great actor past his prime, Louis refused to bow out gracefully. Even as his hair greyed and his joints stiffened, he still pirouetted across marble halls with the same enthusiasm he had as a teenager. Courtiers watched in strained silence, knowing better than to show discomfort. When the king dances, you smile, even if your teeth are grinding, even if his last leap nearly pulled a hamstring, even if the music ended 10 seconds ago. To Louis, ballet wasn't just art. It was politics. Every grand jeté reinforced his absolute authority. Every minuet was a subtle reminder, I am culture. He believed his physical presence radiated majesty, and dancing became a way to literally move through power. And Versailles? That wasn't a palace. It was an elaborate set. The gardens, the mirrors, the endless gilded halls, all carefully crafted to reflect Louis's mythic persona. He didn't just build a court, he choreographed it. Nobles were required to participate in elaborate ballets, their rank often determined by how close they stood to the king mid-dance. Diplomacy through plie. But behind the elegance was insecurity. Louis was obsessed with image. Mirrors followed him like shadows. He commissioned portraits with idealized features. Even his ballets were staged to highlight his best angles, and those who dared mock his devotion to dance, exiled, discredited, or worse, forced to choreograph the next event. To modernize, it all seems theatrical in the extreme, but to Louis, it made perfect sense. Why rule silently when you can declare your divinity through interpretive movement? Of course, not all kings used their stage presence for ballet. Some preferred bonfires and witch hunts, and just like that, Louis XIV pirouetted into middle age, while James VI was busy hunting witches like it was a seasonal sport. If you've made it this far, you're officially past the point of no return, so go ahead and subscribe for more monarchic mayhem delivered with a side of sarcasm. And while we're at it, where are you watching from? And what time is it? Is this your midnight meltdown in Montreal? Your 4 p.m. brain break in Bangalore? We read every comment, partly for data, mostly for fun. Alright. Let's see what happens when Sweden sends a cross-dressing queen to shock the Pope. King James VI of Scotland, James I of England, was terrified of witches and personally supervised witch trials. For a man educated in logic, theology, and statecraft, King James VI of Scotland, who later became James I of England, had one very specific and undying fear: witches. Not in the metaphorical, political sense. Actual broomsticks and cauldrons, witches. And unlike most rulers who delegated such superstitions to underlings, James didn't just believe in witches. He hunted them, obsessively. It started with a storm, a voyage gone wrong. His new bride, Anne of Denmark, was delayed by harsh weather while crossing the North Sea. Naturally, the explanation wasn't poor navigation or seasonal winds, it was witches summoning tempests. Obviously. Rather than shrug it off, James launched a full-scale investigation. He interrogated suspects personally. Tortured confessions were extracted, names were named, and soon an entire web of sorcery was unveiled. Dozens of women were accused, some were executed. The king kept notes. James became so enthralled by the subject that he wrote a book, Demonology, a full treatise on the reality of witches, the dangers they posed, and why they must be rooted out with extreme prejudice. In it, he described witches as people who had renounced God and served the devil in exchange for unholy powers, like flying, conjuring storms, or terrifyingly making men impotent. That last one may explain some things. When he ascended the English throne in 1603, he brought his paranoia with him. England, which had seen its fair share of witch trials, now had a monarch with a personal vendetta. His court became a hotbed of suspicion. Trials increased, fear spread, and James continued to peer into the darkness, convinced Satan had agents hiding in plain sight, possibly at tea. But here's the twist. Later in life, James changed his mind. He began to doubt the reliability of witch confessions. He realized many trials had been manipulated. In some cases, he intervened to halt executions. The very man who fueled the hysteria slowly stepped back from it, a monarch chastened by his own fanaticism. Still, the damage was done. His early reign left a legacy of paranoia that rippled through both kingdoms. People had suffered, died, and vanished into the flames, all because the king was scared of the wind. And yet, for all his theological rigidity, James couldn't hold a candle to the queen who came to Rome dressed as a man, carrying a sword, and announced she'd be converting religions just for the vibes. Queen Christina of Sweden shocked Rome by abdicating, converting to Catholicism, then wearing men's clothes and carrying a sword everywhere. There are rule breakers. And then there's Queen Christina of Sweden, who kicked the rules in the teeth, set fire to the etiquette book, and rode off to Rome dressed like a Renaissance-era rock star. Christina ascended the throne at age 6, ruled by 18, and abdicated by 27, not because of scandal, rebellion, or incompetence, but because she just wasn't feeling it. Monarch life bored her, marriage repulsed her, and Lutheranism not quite fabulous enough. So she made a choice, a very public, very dramatic choice. She renounced the Swedish crown, packed her things, and rode, sword at her hip, in men's clothing, across Protestant Europe, a queen no longer, but still commanding attention wherever she went. Her destination, the Vatican. Because if you're going to abandon your throne and your faith, you might as well do it in style. Rome welcomed her like a celebrity. Papal guards saluted, crowds gathered, and Christina, swaggering, sharp-tongued, fiercely intelligent, basked in it. She converted to Catholicism with full ceremony, but she didn't stop there. She flouted gender norms at every turn. She wore breeches, carried weapons, and hosted philosophical salons where she debated art, science, and metaphysics with popes and cardinals. Rumors about her personal life swirled constantly. Affairs, obsessions, secret lovers. She responded to all of it with a shrug and a quote. "I was born free, and I live as I choose." And she meant it. Christina wasn't just rebelling against Sweden, she was rebelling against expectation, against the notion that queens must marry, that women must behave. That faith must be inherited, not chosen. Her life became a kind of performance, a high-concept work of political theatre, equal parts rebellion and reinvention. She stayed in Rome for the rest of her life, occasionally broke, occasionally controversial, always unforgettable. Her tomb rests in St. Peter's Basilica, one of the few women buried there, because even death, apparently, made an exception for her. And if you think that's eccentric, wait until you hear what happened when Napoleon Bonaparte tried to organize a rabbit hunt and got attacked by the prey. Napoleon Bonaparte once got attacked by a horde of bunnies during a rabbit hunt gone wrong. You'd think that Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who conquered most of Europe, crowned himself emperor, and rewrote military strategy forever, could handle a rabbit, or a few dozen, or even a few hundred. But know in what might be the most humiliating footnote in imperial history, Napoleon was once defeated by bunnies. This wasn't some fever dream. It happened. The year was 1807, and Napoleon had just signed the Treaty of Tilsit, solidifying his dominance over much of the continent. Spirits were high. Morale was imperial. So naturally, someone suggested a celebratory rabbit hunt. His chief of staff, Alexandre Berthier, took the idea and ran with it. He arranged an extravagant outdoor event, champagne, canapes, a selection of fine cheeses, and had hundreds, some say thousands of rabbits delivered for the occasion. The plan was simple. Release the rabbits, hand Napoleon a gun, and let the emperor enjoy a little harmless sport, a charming afternoon of pastoral pageantry. Only, there was a problem. Berthier hadn't sourced wild rabbits. He bought domesticated ones, fluffy, well-fed, and very used to being fed by humans. So when the cages were opened, the rabbits didn't scatter in fear. They hopped toward the emperor, expecting snacks. At first, it was amusing. Napoleon laughed. His entourage chuckled. Then more rabbits came. Then more. Dozens. Hundreds. A sea of soft fur and twitching noses surged across the field, bounding straight at the man who had once marched on Moscow. It stopped being funny when the rabbits started climbing onto boots, tugging at trousers, and scrambling up coattails. Napoleon tried to shoo them. His generals tried to form a defensive line. It didn't work. The rabbits overran everything. They invaded the carriages. They stormed the picnic tables. And Napoleon, Emperor of France, terror of Europe, reportedly retreated, laughing nervously and brushing fur off his uniform as his staff tried to fend off the advancing lagomorphs with walking sticks and hats. This was not the stuff of military legend. There were no medals, no monuments, no odes, just a field full of confused rabbits and one very embarrassed emperor. What's poetic here is that Napoleon, who prided himself on control over armies, nations, destinies, lost that control to an animal best known for twitching and multiplying. And it all started with a miscalculation, the assumption that everything, even nature, could be choreographed. He conquered Europe, but he couldn't outmaneuver lunch-hungry bunnies. And while Napoleon's humiliation came from an accidental petting zoo rebellion, his English counterpart once challenged an entire kingdom to wrestling, and lost. King Henry VIII of England once challenged the King of France to a wrestling match. He lost. There are many words you could use to describe King Henry VIII of England. Volatile, charismatic, vengeful, bloated but humble was not one of them. This was a man who rewrote religion to get a divorce, who ate like a royal boar, and who looked in the mirror each morning and saw a god in velvet. So, naturally, when he met King Francis I of France in 1520 during the Field of the Cloth of Gold, an event so dripping in luxury that the tents were made of literal gold-threaded fabric, Henry decided diplomacy could wait. He wanted to wrestle. Francis, younger, sleeker, and no less vain, agreed. The two monarchs, both dressed like medieval disco balls, stood before a glittering crowd of nobles, jesters, and horses that probably cost more than small villages. The mood was festive, wine flowed. Trumpets blared, courtiers placed bets, and then, in full royal dignity, the kings lunged at each other. It did not go well for Henry. Despite his reputation as a fearsome figure, the kind of man who could glare a bishop into silence, Henry was swiftly flipped onto his back by the French king. Clean, no controversy. The move was elegant, humiliating, and witnessed by hundreds. To make matters worse, Francis reportedly offered a hand to help Henry up. The English king refused, possibly grumbling something about slippery grass or divine injustice. Either way, he never challenged Francis again. And the wrestling match, meant as a show of mutual strength, became a quiet reminder that England's lion had a bit of a glass jaw. What's fascinating is how quickly the mood shifted. The Field of the Cloth of Gold was meant to be a diplomatic spectacle, a week-long peace summit disguised as a party. But under all that, velvet was ego. And ego, when bruised, does not forgive easily. Henry returned home red-faced, and determined to make his court the most dazzling in Europe. New palaces were built, ceremonies became longer, and his appetite for food, wives, and glory only intensified. But in the end, it wasn't duels or banquets or even decapitations that defined Henry's most honest moment. It was the day he got body slammed in front of half of Europe and never spoke of it again. Of course, not all kings obsessed over power and dominance. Some simply wanted to live in a fairy tale, preferably in a swan-decorated sleigh. King Louis II of Bavaria built extravagant castles, inspired by fairy tales, and spent nights riding in sleighs, decorated like swans. If you've ever looked at a Disney castle and thought, that seems impractical, you can thank King Louis II of Bavaria, the patron saint of expensive loneliness and unrestrained whimsy. Known as the Swan King, Louis was less interested in ruling and more interested in pretending he was a character in Wagnerian opera. He detested court politics, avoided crowds, and often referred to himself in the third person. He spent most of his time and most of Bavaria's money building castles that looked like the fever dreams of a romantic architect on absinthe. The most famous, Neuschwanstein, perched dramatically atop an alpine cliff, was never even finished. It was a fantasy, built to be admired from a distance, rarely visited, and filled with murals of dragons, knights, and mythical swans. Everything Louis did was theatrical. He wasn't just playing king, he was playing a king playing a king. But his eccentricities didn't stop at architecture. Louis loved nighttime sleigh rides, not for travel, not for necessity, just for vibes. He would dress in historical costumes, sometimes from centuries he hadn't lived through, and order his servants to drive him through snowy landscapes in custom sleighs shaped like swans, complete with lanterns and velvet cushions. Imagine being a Bavarian farmer, trudging home in the freezing dark, only to see a swan-shaped sleigh glide past, piloted by a silent, elaborately costumed monarch who refused to wave. Louis didn't care. He wasn't riding for the people, he was riding for the moon. He idolized composer Richard Wagner and funded his operas obsessively. Some say Louis saw Wagner as a prophet, others say he just enjoyed the drama. In any case, he built a private theatre so he could watch entire operas alone. Performers would sing to an empty room while Louis sat in a royal box, silently crying or clapping, depending on the act. His ministers, meanwhile, panicked. The treasury dwindled. Bavaria needed infrastructure. Louis wanted another turret. Eventually, they declared him insane. He was deposed, institutionalized, and mysteriously found dead days later, floating in a lake with his psychiatrist. Conspiracy theories abound. Was it suicide? Was it murder? Or was it the final act of a life lived entirely as performance? Louis's legacy endures not in laws or reforms, but in fantasy. Tourists flock to Neuschwanstein, not realizing they're walking through the ruins of a man's daydream, a castle too theatrical to rule from, too perfect to be real. And yet, in its hollow towers, you can still hear the echoes of sleigh bells. Catherine the Great of Russia imported 400 English cows because she preferred their milk for her tea. You can say a lot about Catherine the Great of Russia, but subtlety was never one of her hobbies. She modernized an empire, rewrote Russian politics, collected lovers like they were collectible stamps, and still had time to obsess over milk. Not just any milk, English milk. Specifically, milk from English cows, because apparently nothing in Russia, not the palaces, not the opera, not the national dairy supply, could meet the precise standards of her afternoon tea. So she ordered 400 cows. From England to Russia, because the milk in her tea had to taste just right. Catherine, you see, was a deeply Anglophilic monarch. She adored British culture, corresponded with English intellectuals. She even had a palace wing designed in neoclassical English style. But importing an entire bovine battalion across Europe because your morning cup isn't hitting the spot? That's dedication bordering on dairy madness. Her royal court, already used to her whims, barely flinched. This was the same woman who once commissioned a life-sized mechanical peacock to dance across her dinner table. If she wanted English cows, the empire would deliver English cows. Never mind the logistics, or the expense, or the fact that these cows had to be coddled like glassware on the long journey. Climate differences? Irrelevant. Russia would build English-style barns if necessary. The cows would live better than half the nobility. Of course, this wasn't just about flavour. It was about control, about refinement. Catherine wielded her preferences like instruments of statecraft. Every aesthetic decision, from her imported wallpaper to her book collection, was a signal. She was not merely a Russian ruler. She was an enlightened empress, worldly and discerning, sipping her imported brew with imperial flair. Tea, in her hands, became a power symbol, a declaration of sophistication. And the cows? They were the unsung footnotes in a performance of cultivated dominance. Yet there's something almost touching about it. Amid the politics, the pressure, and the palace intrigue, Catherine found comfort in a simple ritual: tea with the right milk. An echo of the personal within the imperial. Even absolute rulers need their coping mechanisms. Hers just came mooing with a British accent. And if Catherine curated her life like an art gallery, her predecessor, Peter the Great, treated life like an anatomy museum. Emphasis on museum. Tsar Peter the Great had a collection of preserved body parts and deformed fetuses, which he displayed like trophies. In the catalogue of eccentric monarchs, Tsar Peter the Great doesn't just earn a chapter, he gets his own exhibit, and he'd probably curate it himself. Because Peter, in all his reformist, beard-hating, empire-uprooting glory, had a morbid fascination with the physical body, not in the poetic sense, in the preserved fetuses in jars sense. Welcome to the Kunstkamera, Peter's pet project and Russia's first museum, a cheerful little building on the banks of the Neva River that housed, among other things, amputated limbs, pickled infants with conjoined skulls, human skeletons with extra arms, and a collection of teeth Peter personally extracted from unwilling subjects, not for science, just for fun. Peter's obsession began with his love of Western science. He admired European anatomical theatres, where public dissections were all the rage. So he brought the idea to Russia, determined to drag his nation, kicking, screaming, and partially embalmed into the Enlightenment. He hired Dutch anatomists. He ordered the preservation of unusual specimens. He paid families to donate the bodies of deformed infants, not out of sympathy, but to teach the Russian people that these abnormalities were natural, not the work of evil spirits. A noble goal, executed with the grace of a butcher in a chemistry lab. But he didn't stop there. Peter famously attended and sometimes performed autopsies. He dissected corpses with the enthusiasm of a hobbyist and the delicacy of a czar who once forced nobles to shave their beards under threat of tax. Science, for him, was hands-on, messy, unapologetically weird. The Kunstkamera, while scientifically important, quickly gained a reputation as a house of horrors. Visitors came to gape, some fainted, others claimed the displays were cursed. Peter, undeterred, continued collecting. The rarer the deformity, the better. Was this education? Enlightenment? A ruler's attempt to demystify the human body? Maybe. But it was also an exercise in control, a way of reducing mystery to meat, of placing fear inside glass jars and giving it Latin labels. Today, the Kunstkamera still exists. Its jars are still intact, and the questions Peter raised about science, spectacle, and the fine line between curiosity and cruelty remain just as pungent. And speaking of emperors who demanded applause for questionable performances, allow us to introduce Nero, a man who didn't care about dissection unless the spotlight was on him. Emperor Nero of Rome forced senators to cheer for him while he performed on stage. You know your ego's getting out of hand when the Roman Senate, a body built on tradition, decorum, and long-winded passive-aggressive speeches, is forced to sit in velvet chairs and applaud your interpretive poetry recital. Welcome to the late-night open-mic world of Emperor Nero, who ruled Rome not so much like an emperor, but like a deeply insecure theatre kid with infinite budget and no sense of feedback. Nero fancied himself an artist, a singer, a poet, an actor, a man of culture as long as that culture was centered entirely on him. And unlike past emperors who pretended to tolerate the arts, Nero made it mandatory. When he took the stage draped in silk, face powdered, lyre in hand, nobody was allowed to leave. Not senators, not soldiers, not even slaves. If your wife went into labor during a performance, wait. If you fainted from heat stroke, quietly. Nero's show came first, and the performances were long, sometimes hours, sometimes days. Multiple historians recount how Roman nobles would fake deaths, injuries, or pregnancies just to escape. But most endured clapping rhythmically, smiling with the dead-eyed devotion of people who knew applause might be the only thing keeping them alive. Nero even entered public contests and, shockingly, always won. Every prize, every trophy, every single time. Because who's going to tell the emperor he came in second place to a flute soloist from Alexandria? To Nero, the stage wasn't a diversion from power. It was power. He blurred the lines between art and authority, forcing the elite of Rome to bow not just to his rule, but to his performance choices. Imagine Caesar Augustus returning from the grave only to find the empire being serenaded by a man in glitter sandals, doing dramatic readings of his own love letters. The irony is that Nero's actual rule wasn't entirely incompetent, at least in the early years. But by the time his performances eclipsed policy, Rome was on fire, literally and figuratively, and his hold on power melted faster than stage makeup under torchlight. In the end, he fled the city, not with a legion, but with a lyre. And yet, even Nero would have looked at the next emperor on our list and said, "All right, maybe don't drink that." Emperor Qin Shi Huang of China feared death so much, he drank mercury elixirs, ironically hastening his end. You can conquer kingdoms, burn books, build walls visible from space, and bury armies in clay, but none of it means much when you're terrified of dying. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, was a man obsessed with legacy, but more urgently, he was obsessed with never leaving it behind. He wanted to live forever. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally. To achieve this, Qin did what any absolute ruler with unlimited resources and a growing sense of existential dread would do. He assembled a team of alchemists and mystics and demanded that they find him the secret to immortality. No pressure, just invent eternal life or face execution. Classic job description. They promise solutions, special herbs, magical mountains, and most famously, mercury elixirs. Yes, liquid metal. The same stuff you're told in science class not to touch with bare skin was, in ancient Chinese alchemical circles, considered a heavenly substance. If it gleamed and shimmered unnaturally, surely it had cosmic power. So, Qin drank it. Routinely, daily even, thinking it would preserve him forever. Spoiler alert, it didn't. The mercury likely damaged his brain, accelerated his decline, and quite possibly killed him faster than natural causes would have. His paranoia deepened. His behavior grew erratic. He dispatched expeditions to mythical lands in search of immortal sages and magic mushrooms, most of whom never returned. One report suggests he sent hundreds of children to sea in search of the elixir, essentially weaponizing hope. Meanwhile, as his body failed him, he worked obsessively on his other version of immortality, his mausoleum. The underground necropolis of Qin Shi Huang is one of the most mind-boggling burial projects in history, featuring the terracotta army, thousands of clay soldiers, each with unique features, guarding him for eternity, art imitating afterlife. What's ironic is that Qin, in trying to defy death, ended up memorializing it in stone. His empire fractured shortly after his passing. His dynasty didn't last, but his tomb did. In chasing eternal life, he accidentally became eternal through death. And that's the poetic tragedy of Qin Shi Huang. The man who tried to live forever became a legend precisely because he didn't. Of course, if you're planning to live forever, it helps to eat well. Or, if you're Empress Dowager CIXI, to demand 120 dishes a day just to keep your palate entertained. Empress Dowager CIXI of China demanded that her meals include exactly 120 dishes prepared daily. There's a difference between being a picky eater and being Empress Dowager CIXI of the Qing dynasty, who elevated dining to a form of imperial theater. Every single day, the imperial kitchens were tasked with producing exactly 120 dishes for her personal consumption. Not for a banquet, not for a visiting delegation, just for her. The odds that she tasted all 120? Low, but that wasn't the point. CIXI, like many rulers before her, used food not merely as nourishment, but as a symbol of scale. The more complex the menu, the greater the power it implied. Each dish was a brushstroke in the portrait of her dominance. Boiled duck tongue, gold-dusted dumplings, chrysanthemum soup, shark fin stew. These weren't meals. They were edible declarations. The imperial kitchen functioned like a military operation. Thousands of staff worked around the clock to prepare the daily spread, balancing flavors, textures, regions, and appearances. Each dish had to be presented in perfect symmetry, accompanied by silk menus and jade utensils. Temperature was monitored, steam was calculated. Some dishes were crafted not to be eaten, but simply to be seen. Of course, no one outside her immediate circle dared question it. When you've held de facto power in the empire for nearly 5 decades, surviving palace coups, foreign invasions, and internal revolts, you're allowed to be particular. And yet, despite her extravagant meals, CIXI was not known for gluttony. She often took small bites. Sometimes she merely inspected the dishes. The food wasn't about indulgence, it was about control. In a male-dominated court, her palate became her kingdom, a throne of porcelain and plum sauce. Some stories say she could identify a single missing spice with one taste. Others claim she kept personal chefs under surveillance to ensure absolute obedience. Whether those tales are apocryphal or exaggerated by mystified Western diplomats, they serve the same narrative purpose: to build the image of a woman so powerful that even her snacks trembled. But perhaps the most revealing thing about Cix's 120-dish ritual is what it hides: a profound sense of isolation. All that preparation, all that opulence, for a solitary meal in a room that echoed too loudly. If Cix's kitchen was her empire, then her dining table was its battlefield, and every course, no matter how delicately plated, came with a silent reminder: even absolute rulers dine alone. Of course, some emperors didn't want 120 dishes, they wanted one very specific kind of immortality potion. Just ask Emperor Wu of Han, who thought crushed jade might do the trick. Emperor Wu of Han believed immortality could be achieved by drinking potions made with jade powder. You could say Emperor Wu of Han had high standards. He ruled for over half a century, expanded China's borders dramatically, and turned his dynasty into a juggernaut of military and cultural dominance. But despite his success, he too suffered from a distinctly royal affliction, the fear of dying. And his remedy of choice? Jade, not as a decorative gem, not carved into sculptures, in powder form, swallowed. In ancient Chinese cosmology, jade wasn't just a luxury mineral, it was believed to contain spiritual essence. It symbolized purity, endurance, and the link between heaven and earth. If your tomb was lined with jade, your soul might remain uncorrupted. If you drank it, well, maybe your body would too. Emperor Wu took this logic to its absurd conclusion. His court alchemists, under imperial pressure and fear of being reassigned to less glamorous careers, like exile, concocted potions using jade powder mixed with various exotic substances. The idea was to preserve the emperor from within, to turn his organs into little shrines of eternity. Of course, ingesting ground-up minerals is not, as modern medicine would point out, particularly safe. It's hard on the kidneys, harder on the intestines, and completely ineffective as an anti-aging treatment. But Wu was undeterred. He drank, he meditated. He commissioned ever more elaborate rituals involving mountains, constellations, and mystic priests with suspiciously high fees. Jade powder became his personal sacrament. And like many rulers chasing immortality, Wu seemed to age faster the more desperately he tried to stop it. His later years were filled with paranoia, purges, and a growing obsession with omens, bad weather, comets, eclipses, anything that hinted his time was running out. Ironically, he also outlawed many other dangerous elixirs, criticizing them as fraudulent while continuing to sip on what amounted to powdered rock. Self-awareness, not exactly in royal supply. But if nothing else, Wu's devotion to the jade diet shows the ancient intersection of mysticism, science, and vanity, where emperors, for all their power, remained terrified of the one thing they couldn't command. At least Wu died believing he had done everything possible to cheat fate, a man who turned to stone, metaphorically speaking, just to avoid turning to dust. And yet, for all the philosophers and potions in the East, the next emperor simply skipped science altogether and let a pet lion roam free in the palace. Mughal Emperor Jahangir of India kept a pet lion and allowed it to roam freely in court. If you thought having a poorly trained dog in the office was a management issue, imagine working for Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who preferred a pet with considerably sharper teeth and zero impulse control. A lion. A real one. Not in a cage, not behind velvet ropes, just walking around. Jahangir, son of the legendary Akbar the Great, ruled a sprawling empire known for its architectural marvels, its opulence, and its culture, but also for his personal quirks, which included collecting rare animals, creating bizarre taxidermy experiments, and, yes, letting a live lion hang out in the royal court like it was a particularly edgy lapdog. According to court historians, Jahangir's lion was allowed to roam at will during public audiences, lounging near the throne and sometimes pacing between terrified officials. Courtiers were expected to maintain composure while a predator with the bite strength of a freight train stared them down mid-report. Imagine reading the quarterly grain surplus figures while also making sure you didn't look like prey. Why? Well, The symbolic messaging was obvious. Jahangir wanted to convey divine authority, imperial dominance, and supreme fearlessness. In Mughal iconography, kings were often shown with lions, tigers, or elephants as metaphors for their strength. Jahangir didn't just pose with one, he brought the metaphor to work. But this wasn't just theatrical cruelty. Jahangir had a genuine fascination with animals. He kept detailed journals describing their behavior, diet, even moods. He named some of them. He had portraits commissioned. He once ordered an anatomical comparison between an African lion and an Indian lion, just to see what made them different. This wasn't just a royal pet, it was part of a larger philosophy, the emperor as master of both men and beasts. Still, there's a line between awe and absurdity, and Jahangir danced on it like a tightrope artist. Foreign visitors at his court were both dazzled and deeply unnerved. One Jesuit priest described the scene with barely concealed panic. Others thought it was a joke until the lion growled. Surprise, it wasn't. The lion reportedly died of natural causes, after which Jahangir mourned it like a fallen general. A tomb was not built, but you get the sense he considered it. In the emperor's mind, to master a lion was to master nature and by extension, destiny. But to his courtiers, it was just another day of hoping the king's favorite predator didn't get hungry during budget announcements. And speaking of Mughal rulers with expensive tastes, Jahangir's father-in-law, Shah Jahan, didn't just love animals. He loved jewels so much, he sat on them. Shah Jahan loved gemstones. So much he had thrones, encrusted with rubies, emeralds, and giant diamonds. Most people show wealth through a nice watch or a tasteful ring. Shah Jahan, builder of the Taj Mahal, preferred to sit on his wealth, literally. His throne, known as the Peacock Throne, wasn't just opulent, it was a bedazzled shrine to the idea that power should glow. Constructed in the 17th century, the throne reportedly cost 4 times as much as the Taj Mahal, which should already raise eyebrows. The Taj was a marble megastructure, a mausoleum for a lost love, and a global icon. The throne? A chair, albeit one encrusted with hundreds of rubies, sapphires, pearls, and at least one absurdly large diamond that later found its way into the British crown jewels. Royal recycling. The design was as theatrical as it was financially insane. It featured golden peacocks with gem-encrusted tails, jeweled pillars, and a canopy supported by enameled columns. Every surface glittered. It wasn't just a seat, it was a statement. I am the center of the world, and the world is made of gemstones. And the best part, Shah Jahan didn't even use it every day. This wasn't his go-to chair for reading reports or sipping cardamom tea. It was a special occasion seat, a kind of ceremonial power podium. Something to dazzle visiting dignitaries and cow disobedient governors. Sit here, and you weren't just king, you were cosmic royalty. But behind all that sparkle was a ruler grappling with legacy. Shah Jahan's obsession with grandeur was tied to his fear of impermanence. He built monuments to outlive him. The Taj Mahal wasn't just about love, it was about eternity. And the Peacock Throne? It was a glittering dare to history. Forget me if you can. Unfortunately, the throne's fate was less eternal. It was looted by Nader Shah of Persia during the invasion of Delhi in 1739. Dismantled, melted down, cannibalized for other thrones, its jewels dispersed across empires. The throne became a ghost, a shimmering legend whose pieces now decorate other monarchies. The irony, Shah Jahan's monument to himself didn't last, but the marble tomb he built for someone else did. And if you think Shah Jahan's ethical consistency is shaky, wait until you meet his spiritual predecessor, a ruler who banned animal sacrifice and then built himself a private royal zoo for fun. Emperor Ashoka of India banned animal sacrifice, yet maintained a large hunting park just for fun. There's reformers, and then there's Emperor Ashoka, one of the most complex contradictions in ancient history. After conquering most of the Indian subcontinent in the 3rd century BCE, he underwent a dramatic transformation. From brutal warrior to devout Buddhist, Ashoka became the poster child for royal repentance. He renounced violence. He erected pillars across the empire, proclaiming messages of peace and tolerance. He banned animal sacrifice and state rituals. His edicts carved into stone urged compassion, dharma, and ethical governance. And yet he kept a massive royal hunting park for recreational use. It was less a park and more a wildlife resort where Ashoka could ride out and observe or occasionally hunt exotic animals. Deer, boars, peacocks. He wasn't sacrificing them at temples anymore, just tracking them for leisure. So, what gives? Ashoka's contradictions weren't a PR oversight. They were an open secret. His embrace of Buddhism was sincere, but incomplete. Like many rulers, he adopted the parts of religion that served his political aims and ignored the ones that didn't fit his lifestyle. Non-violence? Yes, in public. But privately, a little royal adrenaline never hurt. Historians still debate whether Ashoka actually hunted post-conversion or simply maintained the park for display. But the fact remains, the empire funded it. Guards patrolled it. Animals were imported to stock it. It was real, and it was very not Buddhist. And yet, Ashoka's reign is still remembered as a golden era of moral governance. His contradictions weren't hidden, they were carved into the very stones that praised him. Which raises the question, can a ruler be both deeply flawed and deeply sincere? Apparently yes, if you're Ashoka, and your ethics are written in granite and decorated with the occasional deer chase. Next up, a Japanese emperor who went from divine ruler to jellyfish enthusiast, because power, like marine life, tends to drift. Emperor Hirohito of Japan was obsessed with marine biology and personally described over 30 new species of jellyfish. There's ruling an empire, and then there's ruling an empire while classifying gelatinous sea creatures in your spare time. Emperor Hirohito of Japan, known posthumously as Emperor Showa, wasn't just the head of state during the most tumultuous era in Japanese history. He was also a card-carrying marine biologist, obsessed with the soft, translucent citizens of the ocean. Jellyfish. Yes, while the military plotted, the World War escalated, and diplomats held their collective breath, Hirohito could often be found bent over a microscope, quietly sketching a Cnidarian specimen in his lab coat in the imperial palace, with the intensity of a man who genuinely found peace in plankton. He didn't just dabble, he published. His scientific works appeared in peer-reviewed journals. He collaborated with renowned marine researchers, corresponded internationally about sea cucumbers, hydrozoans, and deep-sea invertebrates. He described over 30 new species, with his name attached in Latin taxonomy like a microscopic signature. This was not a vanity project. It was genuine science. In fact, Hirohito's marine research became one of the few areas of his life where people could engage with him without political landmines. While historians debated his role in World War II, his silence during key atrocities, and the degree of his control over the military, one thing was uncontested. The man knew his jellyfish. His Imperial Marine Biology Lab was built within the palace grounds, stocked with equipment that rivaled any academic institute. He collected specimens during imperial tours. Divers fetched them for him. Staff preserved them in jars, some of which are still archived in Japanese institutions. While foreign leaders posed with nuclear weapons, Hirohito posed with a squid. There's something almost haunting about it. The juxtaposition. A figurehead of empire, symbolic of divine power, tracking the undulations of a Medusa under glass. What does it mean when an emperor, surrounded by nationalists and generals, chooses to spend his quiet hours naming sea life? Was it escapism, guilt, or just scientific passion in its purest form? Even in the aftermath of the war, when Japan lay in ruins and Hirohito's divinity was publicly renounced, he kept studying. He spoke more freely with marine biologists than with politicians. In interviews, he often sounded more animated talking about mollusks than he ever did about policy. And perhaps that's the most human part of him. A man with immense symbolic power who, in the end, chose to see the world through glass slides rather than binoculars. A man who catalogued creatures with no brains, no hearts, and no bones, yet still found them worthy of attention. But if jellyfish fascinated Hirohito, cats were divine to another emperor, one who wrote poetry in their honor and believed they were celestial companions on the path to enlightenment. Emperor Go-Daigo of Japan once wrote poetry about his favorite cats, calling them divine companions. History tends to focus on warlords, reforms, and royal intrigue. But sometimes, tucked between the bloodshed and the bureaucracy, you find something far more unexpected. A royal cat poem. Emperor Go-Daigo of Japan, who ruled during the chaotic 14th century Kamakura period, is remembered for many things: attempted political revolutions, clashes with the samurai class, and a failed effort to restore imperial power. But among his lesser-known legacies is this: he really loved cats, and he wrote poetry about them. Go-Daigo didn't merely own cats. He revered them, admired them, described them in verse as divine companions and whiskered sages. His writings are peppered with reflections on their elegance, their independence, their mysterious behavior. In a world torn apart by military coups and shifting alliances, he saw in his cats something rare: pure, unaffected serenity. According to court documents and historical fragments, he kept several cats in the palace. They were not merely pets, they were symbols of grace, of introspection, of the quiet strength the emperor so often wished he could manifest in politics. When a favorite cat passed away, he reportedly commissioned a shrine and wrote a lament. In traditional waka form, it wasn't performative eccentricity. In Japanese aesthetics, animals often carry spiritual significance. Cats, in particular, were associated with protection and mystery. Go-Daigo, steeped in Buddhist philosophy and surrounded by imperial tension, found in their silent gaze a kind of meditative companionship. Where humans betrayed him, the cats purred. And perhaps it's not so strange. Here was a monarch under siege by rival factions, by dissatisfied nobles, by the shogunate's expanding shadow clinging to a source of calm that asked nothing from him. No loyalty oaths, no armies, just a soft presence in the corner of a room, licking its paw and ignoring protocol. Imagine a late-night imperial study, candlelight flickering, maps of Japan scattered across the table, and an emperor deep in thought as a tabby jumps onto the desk and sits on the diplomatic scrolls. Divine Indifference, Feline Edition. His love for cats didn't outlive his political ambitions. After his downfall and exile, the poetry was forgotten for centuries. But today, fragments remain small, delicate verses that tell a different story than the one found in military annals. A story of a lonely ruler and his quiet companions. And while Daigo's cats remain near the throne, the next ruler took his love for food far beyond the palace, dragging a traveling kitchen across the Mongol Empire just to avoid eating average. Kublai Khan was so fond of food that he had cooks travel with him on military campaigns just to prepare feasts. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, founder of the Yuan dynasty, emperor of China, conqueror of peoples, and above all, enthusiast of feasts. While his armies thundered across continents and his advisors debated imperial law, Kublai's most pressing concern often remained, what's for dinner? He wasn't just a glutton, he was a culinary perfectionist. When Kublai travelled, whether for diplomacy, military campaigns, or just imperial inspection, he brought his entire kitchen staff with him. Not just a chef or two, but a full-scale operation. Chefs, bakers, butchers, spice specialists, and even tea brewers. Dozens of carts packed with fresh ingredients, cooking tools, and delicacies from across Asia followed him wherever he went. It was less of a campaign and more of a mobile five-star restaurant with the occasional siege. Because food, for Kublai, wasn't a side dish to conquest, it was part of empire itself. His menus featured ingredients from every corner of the Mongol world. Tibetan barley, Chinese dumplings, Persian saffron, Russian game. He turned dinner into diplomacy. Invited guests were seated under lavish tents and served intricate meals that displayed both his wealth and the vastness of his domain. You weren't just fed, you were educated. This obsession with cuisine was deeply personal. Kublai was known to spend hours with his chefs, debating ingredients, asking about spices, even suggesting pairings. His palaces in Khanbalik, modern Beijing, contained entire wings devoted to food preparation. He once ordered a team to develop noodle-based maps of his empire. Cartography you can slurp. And despite his military prowess, Kublai was not a rugged outdoorsman. He preferred silk robes to armor, poetry to battle cries, and most importantly, seasoned meat to campfire gruel. His commanders sometimes struggled to keep pace, not with the enemy, but with the supply line of imperial kitchen carts rolling behind them like an army of spice merchants. In this, he reflected the Mongol shift from raiding nomads to settled rulers. Kublai didn't just want to conquer, he wanted to cultivate, to transform Mongol supremacy into a sustainable imperial culture. Food, in all its richness, was both a literal and symbolic tool. The contrast was stark. Horsemen in armor chasing down rebels in the hills, and behind them, a chef gently seasoning lamb with imported herbs, wondering if the emperor would like more salt. And while Kublai's cooks ensured his palate was never bored, another emperor would discover beer, declare it medicinal, and proceed to make treatment a daily ritual. Emperor Meiji of Japan tried Western beer for the first time and declared it medicine so he could drink freely. In the grand drama of Japan's modernization, Emperor Meiji is often cast as the sober visionary, the leader who dragged a feudal island nation into the steam-powered, cannon-laced whirlwind of the 19th century. Under his reign, Japan traded in its samurai swords for railroads, top knots for top hats, and cherry blossoms for beer. Specifically, Western beer, the kind served in tall glasses and foaming with the promise of industrial-age modernity. When Meiji first tried beer, it was part of Japan's new obsession with Western culture. French cuisine, German military drills, British legal codes, everything foreign was suddenly fashionable. The emperor himself was no exception. In the pursuit of modernization, he sampled all sorts of imported delights. But when he tasted beer for the first time, something unusual happened. He didn't just enjoy it, he rebranded it. He declared it medicine. And just like that, beer previously viewed as a foreign oddity gained imperial endorsement. Not as a drink, not as indulgence, but as a wellness regimen. The emperor was simply taking his medicine, thank you very much, daily, sometimes twice. Now, Meiji wasn't a heavy drinker by European standards. He wasn't stumbling through the palace slurring kanpai to strangers, but he was meticulous. Beer appeared regularly at official banquets, state dinners, and even quiet afternoons. Ministers began drinking it too, not out of peer pressure, but because, after all, it was medicine. What kind of fool would question imperial healthcare? Breweries noticed. Domestic beer production skyrocketed. Japanese companies like Sapporo and Kirin began as efforts to localize this now essential remedy. Labels changed. Ads shifted. Beer wasn't about parties. It was about progress. It became a beverage of intellect, refinement, and vague liver support. The irony, of course, is that Meiji's reign was famously austere. He cut government excess. He demanded discipline from his court. He presided over reforms that transformed Japanese society into a sleek, modern machine. But when it came to beer, he bent the rules. Or perhaps rewrote them. And maybe that was part of his genius, understanding that culture isn't just laws and railways. It's rituals. It's what people eat and drink and toast to at the end of a long day. And sometimes it's redefining a pint of ale as a prescription because you really like the taste. So while the emperor reformed the constitution, built an empire, and shifted the global balance of power, he also quietly sipped his way into history, glass by glass, under the watchful eye of court physicians who pretended not to notice. And while Meiji interpreted beer as wellness, another ruler took a very different route. He predicted a solar eclipse with uncanny accuracy, and then used it to impress scientists from the other side of the world. King Mongkut of Siam studied astrology obsessively and once predicted a solar eclipse to impress European scientists. Before there was science, there was astrology. And before there was Google Sky Map, there was King Mongkut of Siam, who spent his spare time poring over celestial charts, calculating planetary alignments by hand, and quietly preparing to blow the minds of 19th century European astronomers. Most kings want to be remembered for power, glory, or military conquests. Mongkut wanted to be remembered for being right about the moon's shadow. Educated in Buddhist monasteries and self-taught in multiple disciplines, King Mongkut, Rama, ruled Siam, modern-day Thailand, from 1851 to 1868. But long before he became king, he was already a respected monk and polymath. Fluent in English and Latin, he read scientific journals from abroad and engaged with Western missionaries and diplomats with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. His favorite subject? Astronomy. While much of the court still leaned heavily on traditional astrology for guidance, Mongkut took a hybrid approach. He used ancient Siamese calculations, cross-referenced them with European science, and began making his own forecasts. Not just vague horoscopes, either. Hard predictions. In 1868, he told the royal court and invited guests that a full solar eclipse would occur on the 18th of August at a precise time in a specific location in southern Siam. European scientists politely nodded. Local astrologers disagreed. But Mongkut was confident. He organized an expedition to the site, set up a royal pavilion, and invited foreign dignitaries and scholars to witness his forecast in real time. And when the eclipse came, it arrived exactly as he'd predicted, minute by minute, degree by degree. The French astronomers were stunned. The British scribbled furiously in notebooks. The Siamese skeptics quietly looked down at their sandals. Mongkut, draped in royal robes, stood at the center of the viewing party like a man who had just checkmated the cosmos. But it wasn't just ego. For Mongkut, this was diplomacy. By proving Siam's intellectual and scientific sophistication, he sent a clear message to colonial powers. We're not your next conquest. We're your equals. In an age when European nations were slicing up Asia like pie, Mongkut used astronomy as a shield. Unfortunately, the celebration had a cost. During the eclipse expedition, Mongkut contracted malaria from the mosquito-infested southern province. He died weeks later, but not before making arrangements for his son, Chulalongkorn, to succeed him, a ruler who would continue the modernization Mongkut had so precisely mapped out. So yes, Mongkut predicted the eclipse, but what he really foresaw was the future of his kingdom, one where knowledge wasn't a colonial export, but a native strength. And if Mongkut bent the stars to his will, the next emperor let love cloud his judgment and handed the reins of an empire to a beauty's family. What could possibly go wrong? Chinese Emperor Xuanzong was so obsessed with his beloved consort, Yang Guifei, that he let her family run the empire, causing chaos. Some rulers are blinded by ambition, others by ideology. Emperor Xuanzong of the Tang dynasty was blinded by love, or at least something dressed in silk and wearing too much perfume. At the height of his power in the 8th century, Xuanzong presided over one of China's golden ages. The Tang dynasty's art, culture, and economy flourished. Trade routes hummed, poetry blossomed, and palaces sparkled with imperial grandeur. But behind the shimmer stood a woman named Yang Guifei, and behind her stood a disaster waiting to happen. Yang was not just another court beauty. She was a legendary figure renowned for her elegance, wit, and musical talent. Xuanzong was smitten, utterly, publicly. He made her one of the few officially designated precious consorts, showered her with gifts, and reportedly delayed state meetings just to hear her play the pipa. But then came the mistake. He trusted her family. In a move that should set off alarm bells in every tragic dynasty, Xuanzong elevated Yang's relatives to positions of immense power. Her cousin, Yang Guozhong, was placed in charge of critical government roles including military appointments. It was nepotism on steroids, and it backfired spectacularly. Under Guozhong's watch, the empire's internal tensions boiled over. He mishandled the powerful general An Lushan, alienating him until he revolted, launching the catastrophic An Lushan rebellion. Millions died, the dynasty's golden age shattered like porcelain, and suddenly the emperor who once floated through scented gardens was running for his life. As rebels stormed the capital, Xuanzong fled with Yang and her entourage. Morale among his troops collapsed. They blamed Yang Guifei and eventually her. The soldiers demanded justice. Xuanzong, cornered by politics and grief, was forced to watch as the woman he adored was taken from him. Her death marked the tragic end of their imperial romance and the beginning of a long national decline. Historians have debated Xuanzong's motivations ever since. Was it blind love? Was it calculated indulgence? Or was he simply weary of ruling and grateful to hand the burden off to anyone who made life feel more poetic? Whatever the reason, the story endures. Not just as a tale of doomed affection, but as a cautionary legend. When emperors mistake intimacy for governance, the empire trembles. And speaking of trembling thrones, the next ruler didn't surround himself with schemers or generals. He preferred 11,000 women, which, yes, raises more questions than it answers. Caliph al-Muqtadir of Baghdad had 11,000 female slaves in his palace, many serving as singers, dancers, and entertainers. In the opulent heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, where the scent of sandalwood floated through marble corridors and poetry echoed beneath domes of gold, Caliph al-Muqtadir of Baghdad reigned not so much as a statesman, but as a connoisseur of spectacle. And nothing embodied that spectacle more than his legendary harem, 11,000 women, many of whom weren't just concubines, but singers, dancers, poets, and entertainers. Let that number sink in. 11,000. That's not a royal household. That's a mid-sized city with exceptionally high perfume consumption. These women lived within the walls of the palace complex, in pavilions and courtyards built explicitly for their accommodation. Their primary role was not political, but cultural. Al-Muqtadir, who ruled during the early 10th century, believed in surrounding himself with beauty, music, and charm. He would hold elaborate evening salons where performers showcased poetry, music, and dance. Many of the women were highly educated in the arts. Some even composed their own verse or wrote music that would later circulate among the elites of the caliphate. But for all the elegance, the sheer size of the harem reflected a deeper truth. Al-Muqtadir's reign was about appearances over substance. While Baghdad sparkled under chandeliers and garden lanterns, the empire beyond its walls was unraveling. Financial mismanagement, military instability, and factional power struggles flourished largely because the caliph, distracted by court pleasures, delegated authority to corrupt advisors and palace officials. The harem became a metaphor for the caliphate itself, sprawling, decadent, increasingly unsustainable. Foreign emissaries marveled at the splendor, but behind the silk screens, rebellion simmered. One couldn't help but wonder how much governance can truly occur in a palace filled with lute music and 11,000 competing voices. Al-Muqtadir's political decline mirrored his personal excess. He was overthrown, reinstated, and eventually killed in a military coup, a victim of his own detachment from the realities of empire. The harem, meanwhile, dissolved into historical curiosity, a vivid symbol of imperial excess, remembered more for its scale than for its substance. And if Al-Muqtadir's indulgence was elaborate, the next caliph turned his court into a stage for elaborate pranks, offering guests glittering gifts only to reveal they were worthless. Caliph Harun al-Rashid loved practical jokes and once gave a man a tray covered in jewels only to reveal they were all fakes. Of all the caliphs of the Abbasid Golden Age, Harun al-Rashid is the one most steeped in legend. He stars in countless tales from 1001 Nights, where he walks the streets of Baghdad in disguise, righting wrongs and solving mysteries like a medieval Sherlock Holmes in embroidered robes. But beneath the folklore lies a ruler who genuinely enjoyed drama, riddles, and one very specific form of governance: the practical joke. Yes, the man who ruled the Islamic world's richest and most cultured empire had a sharp sense of humor and a long memory for revenge. The most infamous tale involves a courtier who had fallen out of favor. Harun summoned the man, pretended all was forgiven, and as a gesture of restored friendship, offered him a golden tray encrusted with what appeared to be diamonds, rubies, and emeralds. The court buzzed. The man wept with gratitude. He paraded the gift through the halls. For a moment, he was back in the good graces of power. Then, quietly, a servant whispered the truth. Everything was fake. Glass, gilded copper, shiny but worthless. It wasn't just a prank, it was a message. In Harun's court, favor was as fleeting as fortune. The tray glittered, but held no value, just like a title given one day and revoked the next. This wasn't a one-off. Harun was known for his love of dramatic irony. He would disguise himself to spy on his ministers. He'd arrange surprise visits to remote provinces. He enjoyed orchestrating elaborate scenarios to test the honesty of officials or the humility of scholars. Some he rewarded lavishly. Others, well, they got the tray. But despite his tricks, Harun wasn't an unserious man. He presided over a cultural renaissance. Baghdad became the intellectual capital of the world, with philosophers, scientists, and poets gathering in his court. The House of Wisdom, a famed center of learning, flourished under his patronage. Still, he couldn't resist the occasional stunt. Historians debate how many of these stories are true, how many were exaggerated, and how many were invented outright by storytellers. But, in a way, it doesn't matter. The enduring image of Harun is not just of a ruler, but of a man who knew that laughter could be power, too. But if Harun delighted in illusion, his Ottoman successor weaponized suspicion, drowning his concubines in a fit of jealousy so extreme, the palace doors may as well have been revolving. Ottoman Sultan Ibrahim the Mad had an entire palace of concubines drowned after suspecting infidelity. There are eccentric rulers, and then there's Sultan Ibrahim I, a man whose reign makes even the wildest royal tantrums look like polite disagreements at brunch. Known to history by the flattering nickname Ibrahim the Mad, the 17th century Ottoman Sultan inherited a powerful empire, but not the emotional stability to manage it. Raised in confinement for much of his early life, as was custom for Ottoman princes to prevent coups, Ibrahim emerged from his gilded cage with a cracked world view and a dangerously suspicious mind. What followed was a reign built on paranoia, indulgence, and abrupt outbursts of cruelty. The most infamous episode? His decision to drown his entire harem, hundreds of women, because he suspected infidelity. No trial, no proof, just a violent purge sparked by a rumor and carried out with disturbing efficiency. The harem, which had been a vibrant social and cultural institution, suddenly became a scene of tragedy. The women, many of whom were artists, musicians, or politically influential, were reduced to pawns in the Sultan's unraveling psyche. One day, they were serenading the ruler. The next, they were gone. Why? Historians still debate. Some blame court intrigue. Others point to Ibrahim's deteriorating mental state, worsened by isolation and manipulation from advisors. There are records of him exhibiting erratic behavior, obsessing over furs, commissioning absurdly expensive gifts for random palace members, and believing that touching certain objects could ward off curses. The Ottoman court, ever skilled at managing dysfunctional monarchs, tried to contain the damage. But eventually, enough was enough. Ibrahim was deposed by his own mother, a political force in her own right, and imprisoned. He was executed shortly thereafter. His reign is often cited as one of the darkest chapters in Ottoman history, not because of wars lost or policies failed, but because it showcased how personal instability could become imperial catastrophe. And yet, for all the horror, the story of Ibrahim remains disturbingly relevant. When unchecked power meets unchecked paranoia, the consequences are both senseless and swift. Coming up next, a sultan who partied so hard on wine, he died from a drunken fall, perhaps the least ceremonial exit in all of imperial history. Sultan Selim II of the Ottoman Empire died after slipping in his palace while drunk on wine. In the long and often blood-stained ledger of Ottoman sultans, Selim II stands out not for conquest, reform, or administrative brilliance, but for his spectacularly undignified exit. Dubbed Selim the Sot by later historians, Selim II was the kind of ruler who would have been much happier as the lead singer in a palace tavern quartet than as the head of a vast Islamic empire. His defining legacy? He drank. A lot. So much so that his father, the legendary Suleiman the Magnificent, likely rolled over in his elaborate tomb on a regular basis. Selim came to the throne in 1566 after a string of politically motivated fratricides and the usual Ottoman court drama. Unlike his father, who had turned the empire into a juggernaut of military and legal reform, Selim had little interest in ruling. He delegated most of the hard work to his Grand Vizier, Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, who essentially ran the empire, while Selim ran through barrels of Cypriot wine. This wasn't a state secret. Diplomats wrote home about it. Court historians whispered it. Even poets, usually eager to flatter, seemed to subtly suggest that maybe, just maybe, the Sultan should step away from the goblet. But Selim was unapologetic. He once launched a military invasion of Cyprus largely to secure better access to the region's wine. That's not a metaphor, that's foreign policy as a wine tour. The end came predictably after a night of heavy drinking. Sources suggest that Selim, returning from a bath, or possibly a wine cellar, slipped, fell, and struck his head on the marble palace floor. He never recovered, no glorious battlefield. No political intrigue, just gravity, tile, and too much Shiraz. The court tried to soften the story, dressing it up in euphemism and ceremonial distraction, but the damage to Selim's reputation stuck. He was remembered less as a ruler and more as a cautionary tale, a man who inherited one of the world's most powerful empires and ruled it like a weekend guest in a luxury spa. And yet, one could argue that Selim understood something few sultans did, the futility of control. He didn't pretend to be a reformer. He didn't stage grandiose proclamations. He just indulged. And then he fell. Next in line, a Persian king who once punished the ocean itself, literally whipped it for disobeying him. Subtlety was not part of the royal toolkit. Persian King Xerxes, I once ordered his men to whip the sea with chains for sinking his fleet. Some monarchs rage against their enemies. Others rage against their advisors, their citizens, or the cruelty of fate. Xerxes I of Persia, however, raged against the ocean. Yes, the actual, physical sea. It happened during his infamous invasion of Greece around 480 BCE, an expedition that already reads like a cautionary tale about overconfidence. Xerxes had assembled a massive army, built pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, modern-day Dardanelles, and prepared to march westward in a grand display of imperial force. Nothing could stop him except, of course, weather. A sudden storm wrecked the bridges, ships were destroyed, plans were delayed, and Xerxes, in true imperial fashion, decided that the real villain here wasn't logistics or the natural unpredictability of maritime travel. It was the sea. So he punished it. He ordered his men to whip the waves, literally. Chains were dragged through the surf. The water was flogged 300 times. Red-hot irons were thrown into the deep. And to cap it all off, his heralds declared loudly, in full ceremony, that the sea was a wicked and disrespectful slave to the Persian crown. This wasn't symbolic theatre. It was meant as genuine retribution. The same way a king might punish a treacherous noble, Xerxes punished the ocean for misbehaving. There's even some debate over whether the soldiers involved were confused or traumatized or just going through the motions to avoid joining the waves themselves. It's both ridiculous and eerily consistent with Xerxes' worldview. As ruler of one of history's largest empires, he believed in cosmic order, a divine hierarchy, where kings stood just beneath the gods and everything else, including nature, should bow accordingly. This wasn't just about superstition, it was about power projection. To punish the sea was to demonstrate that not even the elements could defy Persian will. Never mind that the next few years would prove otherwise. His campaign in Greece would stall. He would lose at Salamis, and the Persian dream of total conquest would begin to unravel. But in that moment, with chains dragging through salt water, Xerxes sent a message not to the sea, which couldn't care less, but to the people watching from the shore. Your king will punish anything that resists him. Of course, some rulers preferred subtler tricks. Not hot irons or whips, but disguises, Jokes and elaborate pranks played on their unsuspecting subjects like Shah Abbas of Persia, who occasionally governed his empire while wearing a fake mustache. Shah Abbas of Persia used to walk incognito among his people in disguise, often playing pranks on them. You know you've reached a rare level of power when your favorite hobby is pretending you don't have any. Shah Abbas the Great of Persia, who reigned during the late 16th and early 17th centuries, wasn't just a shrewd military leader and savvy builder of trade routes. He was also the kind of monarch who would slap on a fake moustache, sneak out the palace gates, and roam the bazaars of Isfahan just to mess with people. He called it governance, others called it mischief. Abbas was obsessed with knowing the mood of the people, not through advisors or carefully edited reports, but first-hand. He wanted to hear what merchants said behind closed curtains, what peasants grumbled about over dinner. So he developed the habit of wandering among them in disguise. He dressed as a soldier, a farmer, a wandering Sufi. Occasionally, just a very chatty man who knew suspiciously much about Persian tax law. But here's the twist. Abbas didn't just eavesdrop, he intervened. He'd strike up conversations, offer advice, challenge corrupt officials in their own marketplaces. In one famous instance, he tricked a greedy merchant into overcharging him, then returned the next day in full royal regalia to publicly shame the man. And sometimes, he just played pranks. He once paid a group of beggars to pretend to be deaf and mute in front of a visiting ambassador, just to see how the man would react. In another story, he convinced a group of travelers that the Shah had died, and then watched their wildly inaccurate theories spiral out of control, only to reveal himself hours later and have a good laugh. This wasn't just play. Abbas believed strongly in personal rule, the idea that a good king should understand the lives of his people, not from a throne, but from a street corner. His nocturnal escapades may sound theatrical, but they gave him insight no official could. He learned what taxes were hated most, which governors were skimming profits, where the whispers of rebellion lived. The irony, of course, is that Abbas, master of disguise, ruled with absolute authority. His spies were everywhere, his punishments swift. But beneath the authoritarian streak was a ruler who understood something rare, the power of presence. To rule people, you had to know them. To know them, sometimes you had to dress like them. And when he tired of playing tricks, he left the bazaars and returned to the palace, where another sultan, generations later, would declare coffee illegal, even as he secretly sipped it behind closed doors. So while Shah Abbas was out pranking his own people in disguise, Sultan Murad IV was banning coffee by day and sipping it in secret by night, because hypocrisy always pairs well with a hot drink. If you're still here, congratulations, you're in deep. Might as well subscribe now and make it official. Also, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it? Is this your sunrise scroll in Nairobi? Your insomnia-fueled binge in Berlin? We're always curious who's roaming the palace halls with us at ungodly hours. Now ready to meet a pharaoh who weaponized honey and nudity for pest control? Sultan Murad IV banned coffee, tobacco, and alcohol in Istanbul, yet secretly drank heavily himself. There's hypocrisy. And then there's Sultan Murad IV, a man who outlawed coffee, tobacco, and alcohol in the Ottoman Empire, and then spent his evenings indulging in all three like it was his personal buffet of forbidden pleasures. Ruling from 1623 to 1640, Murad came to power young and unstable times. His early reign was dominated by palace intrigue, economic chaos, and Janissary uprisings. By the time he seized personal control, he had resolved to bring order to the empire by any means necessary, and that meant cracking down on anything that hinted at dissent or, worse, conversation. You see, coffee houses weren't just about caffeine. In 17th century Istanbul, they were gathering places. People met there to drink strong black coffee, smoke tobacco recently introduced from the New World, and most dangerously talk politics. Murad saw them as breeding grounds for sedition, rumour, and revolutionary thought. So he banned them. Not lightly, with gusto. Murad sent out patrols. If anyone was caught drinking coffee or smoking tobacco, the punishment could be severe fines, beatings, even execution for repeat offenders. He personally disguised himself and roamed the streets at night, busting violators like a one-man Ottoman vice squad. His spies infiltrated cafes, his enforcers demolished benches. Rumour had it he once executed a man for sipping from a suspiciously dark cup. And yet, back at the palace, Murad's own cup runneth over. He was a heavy drinker, particularly fond of wine and arak, and it's widely believed he smoked in private as well. His coffee intake? Substantial. The hypocrisy was obvious to those close to him, but no one dared confront it. After all, Murad was also prone to sudden bursts of violence. He executed high-ranking officials on a whim and reportedly strangled his own brothers to prevent any future challenges to his rule. So why the double standard? For Murad, the bans weren't about morality, they were about control. Coffee and tobacco weren't dangerous because they were vices, they were dangerous because they created spaces where people talked, whispered, plotted. Murad's fear wasn't of stimulation, it was of organization. In banning coffee houses, he didn't eliminate vice, he just monopolized it. He made sure that pleasure was something he alone could afford, while his subjects remained disciplined and quiet. And perhaps it worked. For a while. He restored order, reformed the military, expanded imperial borders. But the cost was a court soaked in paranoia, a city silenced by fear, and an empire that had learned, once again, that truth and power rarely drink from the same cup. And while Murad waged war on the cafe scene, an Egyptian pharaoh came up with a much stranger solution to an even smaller problem: flies. Lots of them. Pharaoh Pepi II of Egypt disliked flies so much that he kept naked slaves, smeared in honey around him, as living fly traps. In the long, gold-dusted scroll of ancient Egypt's pharaohs, Pepi II holds a strange and sticky place. He reigned for more than 90 years, making him one of the longest reigning monarchs in history and one of the oddest. Because while other rulers were concerned with pyramids, politics, and pleasing the gods, Pepi II had one urgent royal dilemma: how to keep the flies off his royal person. His solution? Let's call it deeply inventive. According to ancient records, and more than a few eyebrow-raising retellings by classical historians, Pepi II disliked flies so intensely that he ordered naked slaves to be smeared in honey and stationed near him so that the flies would land on them instead. Think about the logistics. Someone had to apply the honey. Someone had to monitor the slave's stillness. Someone had to clean up the aftermath. This wasn't a one-time stunt, it was apparently a routine part of court life. A whole job category built around attracting insects away from a single man's skin. And here's the most astonishing part. It worked. At least in theory. Flies, ever the opportunists, swarmed the nearest sweet surface, leaving the pharaoh free to go about his day in relative peace. Now, one could argue this was just clever, a ruler with resources solving a problem using the tools available. But let's not ignore the layers. This wasn't pest control. It was theatrical pest control. Pepi didn't just want to avoid being bitten, he wanted to display his power over even the smallest inconveniences. Because that's what pharaohs did. They ruled the land, the river, the people, and apparently the insects. To show weakness, even to a gnat, was to risk divine imbalance. So instead, Pepi turned suffering into policy. What's telling is that this detail survives in historical memory more than any military campaign or building project of his reign. Not because Pepi II didn't do other things he did, but because this act of Baroque absurdity is the kind of thing history refuses to forget. And in a way, it encapsulates monarchy itself, a man so elevated that even nature must be redirected, no matter how irrational the method. And speaking of irrational, the next pharaoh took divinity to an entirely new level, rewriting Egyptian religion, outlawing old gods, and writing hymns to the sun like it was his personal pen pal. Pharaoh Akhenaten forced his court to worship only the sun god Aten and wrote songs to the sun himself. If ancient Egypt had a rock star pharaoh, it was Akhenaten, a king who didn't just tweak the system, but blew it up and started his own band, starring himself and the Sunday. Before Akhenaten, Egyptian religion was a crowded stage, dozens of gods, temples in every city, priests with their own power networks. It was a divine bureaucracy. Akhenaten didn't like that. So he declared all the gods obsolete except one, Aten, the sun disk. And not just the sun as a concept, but as a personal deity that communicated directly with him. To make this work, he changed everything. Temples were closed, priests were sidelined, the capital was moved to a brand new city called Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, built from scratch to worship the Sunday art changed too. Gone were the stiff, idealized figures of traditional Egyptian statuary. Akhenaten commissioned new portraits that showed him with elongated limbs, bulbous features, and tender, almost androgynous poses, often with his wife Nefertiti and their children lounging beneath Aten's rays like a divine family picnic. But the most bizarre part? He wrote love songs to the Sunday. Actual hymns, poetic, personal, and devotional. He praised Aten's warmth, Aten's brilliance, Aten's attention to his life. It was less religious ritual and more celestial fan mail. The most famous, the Great Hymn to Aten, reads like a romantic ode. Akhenaten didn't just worship Aten, he had a relationship with Aten. Historians still debate what drove this religious revolution. Some say it was theological, a genuine move toward monotheism. Others think it was political. By removing all the other gods and their priesthoods, Akhenaten centralized power in himself. If he was the only one who could talk to Aten, then he was indispensable. But like many radical shifts in power, it didn't last. After Akhenaten's death, the old gods came roaring back. His city was abandoned. His name was scratched from monuments. The temples reopened. His son Tutankhamun restored traditional religion, and Akhenaten was filed away as a national embarrassment, a cosmic experiment that ran too long. And yet, there's something oddly touching about him. In an empire obsessed with order and tradition, here was one man standing alone in the desert, singing to the sun and asking it to listen. Maybe it was madness. Maybe it was vision. Either way, it was unmistakably human. And next, we meet a queen who turned drinking contests into economic disasters. Cleopatra, whose pearls were more valuable than diplomacy. Cleopatra of Egypt reportedly dissolved a priceless pearl in vinegar and drank it just to win a bet. As the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Cleopatra VII was no stranger to spectacle. She spoke multiple languages, aligned herself with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony, and presided over a kingdom teetering on the edge of Roman conquest. But among all the rumors and theatrical tales surrounding her life, one stands out as particularly ridiculous, decadent, and if true, deeply acidic. According to the Roman historian Pliny the Elder, Cleopatra once made a bet with Mark Antony that she could host the most expensive dinner in history, a statement that already reeks of drama and looming indigestion. Antony, amused or possibly already tipsy, accepted the challenge. Surely, he thought, no dinner could possibly justify such a boast. Then came the wine goblets. Cleopatra removed one of her earrings, a pearl so large and exquisite that it was considered one of the two most valuable in the world. Without a word, she dropped it into a goblet of vinegar, waited for it to dissolve, or at least soften, and then drank the concoction. Bet 1. The second pearl, reportedly given to a statue of Venus in Rome, making this possibly the only diplomatic gesture ever made via earring donation. Now, chemically speaking, this feat is questionable. Pearls are made of calcium carbonate, and while vinegar is acidic enough to react with them, fully dissolving one would take time, possibly hours, and quite a bit of stirring. But historical embellishment aside, the point of the story isn't the science. It's the message. Cleopatra was so rich, so audacious, and so determined to make a point that she drank something more valuable than most provinces. To Pliny and other Roman chroniclers, the episode proved Cleopatra's vanity and excess. But modern historians see it differently. In a world ruled by male egos and brutal power plays, Cleopatra used performance as politics. The pearl wasn't just jewelry, it was a weapon, a spectacle, a statement of dominance wrapped in a woman's body and weaponized through dinner theatre. And let's be honest, if anyone was going to turn a chemistry experiment into royal one-upmanship, it was Cleopatra. She didn't just rule Egypt, she curated Egypt. Her public image was part goddess, part diplomat, part seductress, part sovereign, and sometimes part culinary daredevil. Of course, giving away vast riches in a single drink may seem outrageous, but it's nothing compared to her West African counterpart, a king whose generosity was so extreme it crashed entire economies. Mansa Musa of Mali, the richest man in history, once gave away so much gold during his pilgrimage to Mecca that he caused inflation across the Middle East. We toss around the term rich a lot. Billionaires, tycoons, CEOs with yachts named after Latin verbs. But none of them, not one, can hold a candle to Mansa Musa, the 14th century emperor of Mali, who remains, by most historical estimates, the richest human being who has ever lived. And he didn't just hoard it, he shared. Or perhaps more accurately, he unleashed it. In 1324, Mansa Musa set off on the Hajj, the sacred Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca. As a devout Muslim and the leader of one of Africa's most powerful empires, he wanted to make a statement. A religious journey, yes, but also a diplomatic mission, a public relations tour, and a rolling economic thunderstorm that would ripple across continents. He brought with him an entourage of 60,000 people, soldiers, servants, officials, and scholars. He carried dozens of camels, each loaded with hundreds of pounds of gold. This wasn't a travel party, it was a moving metropolis. And everywhere he went through Cairo, Medina, and Mecca, he gave gold away, to the poor, to merchants, to mosques, to anyone who crossed his path with a respectful bow and a hopeful pouch. It was generosity on an imperial scale, but here's the kicker. He gave away so much gold that he disrupted local economies. The sudden influx of wealth caused massive inflation, devaluing gold in Egypt for over a decade. Prices skyrocketed, markets destabilized, traders panicked. Musa's pilgrimage became an economic cautionary tale, a golden tidal wave that no one could contain. Imagine being so rich that simply traveling becomes a financial event. Mansa Musa didn't apologize. He understood the optics. He was putting Mali, and by extension, Africa, on the map, literally. After his journey, European cartographers began including West Africa on their maps, often with illustrations of a black king sitting on a golden throne, holding a nugget the size of a melon. But behind the wealth was strategic genius. Musa expanded trade routes, built mosques and universities, and turned Timbuktu into a center of Islamic learning. He wasn't just throwing money around for fun, he was branding an empire, one gold coin at a time. Of course, not all royal grief was solved with gold. Some rulers, when mourning, chose a path not of generosity, but of grief-fueled tyranny. Like the warrior king who banned milk and crops for an entire year because his mother died, King Shaka Zulu imposed bizarre mourning rituals, including banning the planting of crops and the drinking of milk for a year after his mother's death. In the early 19th century, Southern Africa witnessed the rise of one of its most formidable military tacticians, King Shaka Zulu. Ruthless, brilliant, and battle-hardened, Shaka revolutionized warfare with new tactics, restructured the Zulu army into a disciplined machine, and expanded his kingdom through relentless conquest. But when his mother, Nandi, died in 1827, something inside the iron-willed king broke, and what followed was a national grieving process so extreme it bordered on surreal. Shaka didn't just mourn, he legislated mourning. He declared that no crops were to be planted for an entire year, no milk was to be consumed, no festivals, no weddings, no singing. Pregnant women were forbidden from giving birth under penalty of death. If they did, the child and sometimes the mother would be executed. The nation was expected to stop living in honor of one woman's death. This wasn't a gentle spiritual tribute. It was grief as tyranny. The people of the Zulu kingdom, already used to strict military rule, were now starving and terrified. Shaka's spies enforced the bans. His soldiers punished violators. Even the cows suffered. Thousands were slaughtered because, in Shaka's mind, if people couldn't drink milk, then no one could. Why such extremes? Some say Shaka's bond with his mother was unusually intense. She had protected him during his early years when he was cast out by his father's family. She had stood by him as he rose to power. Her death, then, was not just personal loss, it was emotional collapse disguised as national policy. Others argue it was political theatre, a brutal show of control to silence rivals and remind his people of who held absolute authority. Whatever the reason, the result was catastrophic. The people suffered, the land withered, and Shaka's inner circle began to whisper. Months later, he was assassinated by his own half-brother, who took power and swiftly ended the mourning decrees. Yet, even in death, Shaka's legacy endured. His military innovations shaped Southern Africa for generations. But so too did the memory of that long, bitter year when grief became law and mourning became a weapon. And speaking of royal remedies, our next emperor believed that drinking ink from the Bible could cure his illness. Because when medicine fails, sometimes scripture gets a little too literal. Ethiopian Emperor Menelik II believed drinking ink from the Bible would cure his illness. In the long lineage of monarchs who blurred the lines between faith and health, Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia earns a top-tier spot not for his conquests or his diplomacy, though he had both in abundance, but for his belief that drinking pages from the Bible, ink and all, might be the ultimate cure for illness. Yes, you read that correctly. Late in life, as Menelik's health began to decline, plagued by episodes believed to be strokes, the emperor took an unconventional turn toward scriptural medicine. While his court doctors tried herbs, salves, and whatever passed for neurology in late 19th century Ethiopia, Menelik went for the direct approach. he began ingesting pages of the Bible, believing the holy words would literally heal him from within. He didn't just read scripture, he consumed it. And not metaphorically. He had the sacred pages soaked, mashed, and mixed into a kind of digestible pulp. The ink, presumably not intended for gastrointestinal use, was swallowed alongside the paper. The hope? Divine intervention by way of digestion. Now, in his defense, Menelik was a deeply devout Christian. He viewed the Bible as the ultimate authority, morally, spiritually, and apparently medically. This wasn't an act of desperation so much as consuming what he believed to be the most powerful text in existence. If you think of prayer as medicine for the soul, Menelik just assumed it might help the body too, especially if taken in large, page-sized doses. The irony is that Menelik was, in most respects, a remarkably modernizing monarch. He introduced railroads, telephones, and postal systems to Ethiopia. He defeated the Italians at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, one of the most stunning victories of an African army against a European power during the colonial period. He built a new capital, Addis Ababa, and centralized imperial power. But even progressive emperors have their blind spots. As his illness worsened, his consumption of scripture intensified. The Bible's physical text became both sacrament and supplement. Whether this comforted him or merely prolonged his suffering is unknown. He died in 1913, not from a lack of piety, but perhaps from the limits of even the most devout optimism. And perhaps that's the core of this story, the paradox of a man both futurist and fatalist, who built telegraph lines by day and drank ink by night. Progress in one hand, faith in the other. Of course, if Menelik turned to sacred texts for healing, another pharaoh turned to architecture, commissioning more statues of himself than any other ruler in Egypt, some even taller than the gods. Pharaoh Ramses II had over 100 children and made statues of himself taller than the gods. Ramses II, known as Ramses the Great, ruled Egypt for 66 years, fathered more children than most small villages could name, and commissioned so many statues of himself that you'd think he was in a one-man competition against time, mortality, and modesty. Let's start with the numbers. Historians estimate Ramses fathered at least 100 children, possibly more. His harem system was vast, and he built tombs and temples not just for himself, but for many of his wives and children. While ancient Egyptian rulers often had large families, Ramses seemed determined to populate the royal court with his own descendants, as if sheer quantity would ensure dynastic immortality. And then there were the statues. Massive, looming, stone effigies of Ramses were scattered across the empire. You could barely throw a lotus flower without hitting a carving of his face. But perhaps most famously, in the great temples of Abu Simbel, he had 4 colossal seated statues of himself carved into the cliffs, each over 60 feet tall, towering, serene, unmistakably Ramses. The catch? Those statues sat side by side with smaller statues of the gods, as in, Ramses made himself physically larger than the divine beings he was supposedly beneath. Subtle, right? In Egyptian religious tradition, the pharaoh was considered semi-divine, the intermediary between gods and mortals. But Ramses? He nudged the needle. Just a bit. Enough to make it clear. He wasn't just endorsed by the gods, he was outperforming them in public relations. And the imagery didn't stop with stone. In battle scenes, Ramses is depicted single-handedly defeating entire armies, while his soldiers look on like background dancers. In reality, military victories like the famous Battle of Kadesh were closer to stalemates, but Ramses spun them into epics of personal valor. He was a master of the ancient equivalent of state media. But behind the grandeur, there was strategy. Ramses knew that to rule for decades in a competitive, often fractious ancient world, you had to control narrative. Every temple was a monument to stability. Every statue, a silent reminder of continuity. Every child, a potential ally in the court. He died at around 90, a remarkable age for the ancient world, and left behind a reputation as Egypt's greatest builder and self-promoter. Whether he truly believed he was superior to the gods is unclear, but he certainly built like he wanted them to notice. And while Ramses aimed to impress deities, the next ruler on our list was content to impress his taste buds, drinking 50 cups of hot chocolate a day, sometimes with chili peppers, because when you're an emperor, breakfast is just the start of your empire. Emperor Montezuma II of the Aztecs drank 50 cups of hot chocolate daily, sometimes flavored with chili peppers. Before European explorers brought cacao to the rest of the world, before chocolate bars, fondue fountains, or double mocha lattes, there was Montezuma II, Aztec emperor and devout chocophile, whose daily routine included consuming up to 50 golden goblets of hot chocolate. 50. And not the kind of chocolate you'd sip by the fire on a snowy evening. This was exocolatel, a rich, bitter, frothy drink made from roasted cacao beans, often mixed with spices like chili peppers, vanilla, or annatto, and served cold. It was considered sacred, medicinal, energizing, and, in Montezuma's case, deliciously essential. Chocolate, in Aztec culture, wasn't just a beverage, it was currency. Soldiers were paid in cacao beans, taxes were collected in them, priests offered them during rituals. And Montezuma, he treated the drink as both elixir and armor. He believed it enhanced vitality, boosted stamina, and heightened mental clarity, qualities crucial to the business of empire running. Consumed before visiting his harem, before diplomatic meetings, and presumably before morning greetings, the emperor's chocolate intake became legendary. European conquistadors were baffled and impressed. Hernán Cortés later described Montezuma's consumption habits with a mix of reverence and thinly veiled jealousy. To the Spanish, chocolate was exotic. To Montezuma, it was divine fuel. And it wasn't just the drink, it was the presentation. Each of his goblets was made of pure gold and used only once. Afterward, they were discarded or gifted, because nothing ruins the taste of chili-infused cacao like leftovers. So why chili? Because Aztecs believed in the fusion of heat and energy. The bitterness of the cacao combined with the fire of the pepper to create something intense, bold, bracing, almost aggressive, much like their empire. Montezuma's hot chocolate was more than habit. It was ritual, a performance of wealth, health, and supremacy. Every cup was a declaration. The world flows through my hands, and I drink it one goblet at a time. Of course, not every ruler used gold goblets. Some played dice, with golden pieces, and let their subjects win, because that's how you rule when your throne is made. Not of fear, but of generous illusions. Inca Emperor Atahualpa played dice games with golden pieces, but let his subjects win on purpose. There are kings who rule by sword, decree, or divine right. And then there's Atahualpa, the last sovereign emperor of the Inca Empire, who ruled, at least in part, by playing dice. With golden pieces. And not just for entertainment, but as a subtle form of imperial theatre, and a curious, calculated performance of humility. By the time the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, Atahualpa had recently won a brutal civil war against his half-brother, Huáscar, solidifying control over the sprawling Inca domain. But amidst the chaos of consolidation and looming foreign invasion, Atahualpa took time to do something few emperors would dare. He invited commoners to play dice with him, and then he let them win. The game, likely a variant of Pichqua or a similar dice-based pastime, wasn't high stakes in the traditional sense. The real gamble wasn't the gold, it was the optics. Atahualpa used these games to connect with the people. By appearing beatable, approachable, even jovial, he crafted an image of a leader who wasn't afraid of closeness or of pretending to lose. Of course, no one was fooled. The emperor's dice were made of solid gold, his throne was in view, and his guards never stopped watching. But that was the point. The gesture wasn't about actual defeat, it was about graciousness. It told the people, yes, I am powerful. Yes, I am rich, but I still share a game with you. It was political theater, but wrapped in a golden smile. And this wasn't a one-time gimmick. Atahualpa's reign was steeped in ceremonial engagement. Festivals, rituals, and symbolic performances played a critical role in Inca governance. Everything had a deeper meaning. A dice game wasn't just a game, it was a performance of controlled generosity. He gave people the illusion of chance, while keeping control of the rules. What makes this even more poignant is that not long after these moments of playfulness, Atahualpa was captured by Francisco Pizarro's forces. Despite offering an unfathomable ransom, a room filled with gold, he was executed. And the empire unraveled. So in hindsight, those dice games with golden pieces take on a deeper resonance. They were symbolic acts from a man who could no longer afford to lose, even when pretending to. And if Atahualpa ruled with golden games and crafted illusions of equality, another emperor created a literal zoo of exotic animals and people right in the heart of his empire, because nothing says power like collecting the world and caging it. Emperor Moctezuma, the first of the Aztecs, had a zoo with jaguars, snakes, monkeys, and even dwarfs. Before national parks, before safari tours, and centuries before wildlife documentaries, there was Emperor Moctezuma, the Aztec ruler, who curated a living gallery of the natural world, not for science, not for preservation, but for spectacle, status, and spiritual control. His royal zoo, located in the capital city of Tenochtitlan, wasn't just an enclosure, it was an empire within the empire, a space designed to display the breadth of Moctezuma's reach. Within its stone walls were kept jaguars, pumas, snakes, monkeys, colorful birds, alligators, and countless other creatures brought in from all corners of the Aztec realm. This was not a petting zoo, it was more akin to a living map of his conquests. If a region submitted to Aztec control, its most exotic fauna were brought to the capital, caged, and displayed like trophies. Each beast a reminder that Moctezuma ruled the land and everything on it. But animals weren't the only inhabitants. The zoo also housed dwarfs, giants, and people with physical deformities referred to in records as human curiosities. They were cared for, housed, and occasionally presented during ceremonial functions. In Aztec cosmology, individuals with unusual appearances were often believed to possess spiritual insight or divine connections. Within the palace complex, they were both spectacle and symbol. And the logistics? Mind-boggling. Hundreds of caretakers fed the animals, cleaned enclosures, and prepared elaborate rituals meant to appease the gods associated with various species. The jaguars, in particular, were treated with a mixture of fear and reverence, as they symbolized war and nobility. Special attendants fed them daily, often behind heavily guarded barriers. If one escaped, that day became an unscheduled holiday for unfortunate bystanders. Foreigners who visited the zoo, especially later during the reign of Moctezuma II, were stunned. Spanish accounts described it as a wonder of the world, filled with sounds, smells, and colors so overwhelming that it defied their European imaginations. But beneath the spectacle was ideology. Moctezuma's zoo wasn't entertainment, it was cosmic order made visible. Every creature had a spiritual role, every enclosure mirrored some facet of Aztec mythology. Jaguars didn't just pace in cages, they represented the night. Monkeys weren't just mischievous, they embodied particular gods. Even the layout of the zoo reflected sacred geometry. In a world where kings claimed divine favor, Moctezuma went further. He collected the divine, one cage at a time. And while Moctezuma was curating animals like an earthly demigod, on the other side of the world, an emperor was curating something else, photographs, and taking his camera to royal dinners like it was a courtier. Brazilian Emperor Pedro II loved photography so much that he carried cameras everywhere, even to state dinners. Long before smartphones turned every meal into a photo op, there was Emperor Pedro II of Brazil, a 19th century monarch who had two enduring passions, governing a young empire and taking really good photographs of absolutely everything. If most rulers had advisors, generals, and mistresses at their side, Pedro had something else, a camera. Known for his intellect, curiosity, and slightly melancholy demeanor, Pedro II was the kind of man who'd rather spend an evening discussing optics with physicists than attending a gala. He was fluent in multiple languages, corresponded with scientists across Europe, and in the mid-1800s fell head over heels in love with the new art of photography. He didn't just sit for portraits, he took them, developed them, learned the chemistry behind them. His personal collection includes hundreds of glass negatives, images of landscapes, people, architecture, and even experiments with early exposure techniques. When he traveled abroad, he brought his own equipment. While visiting the US, he impressed Thomas Edison with his technical know-how. Queen Victoria, by contrast, was confused but intrigued. And yes, he brought cameras to state dinners. Imagine the scene. Tuxedos, silverware, chandeliers, and at the center of it all, a royal figure quietly adjusting his lens, trying to capture the candlelight on a diplomatic centerpiece. Some dignitaries found it charming, others less so. But Pedro didn't care. For him, photography wasn't just hobby, it was immersion in the real. A ruler staring directly at his empire and freezing it in time. He once said, "I am not a ruler by desire, but by duty. My passion is knowledge." And it showed. His palace library contained more books than some European universities. He funded artists, inventors, and early scientists with royal stipends. When not ruling Brazil, he was essentially its unofficial minister of curiosity. Ironically, despite his modern mind, he was overthrown in a military coup in 1889. The monarchy was abolished. Pedro, heartbroken but dignified, went into exile in Europe, taking his cameras with him. He died in Paris, far from the empire he once captured frame by frame. But his photographs remain, a visual diary of a monarch who ruled not with grandeur, but with a lens. And if Pedro found peace through portraits, the next king found victory not through strategy, but by catching his enemies with a giant fishing net. Because why conquer your foes when you can scoop them like sardines? Hawaiian King Kamehameha, I once used a massive net to catch enemies like fish during battle. In the annals of military history, you'll find plenty of famous battlefield strategies, flanking maneuvers, cavalry charges, guerrilla ambushes. Then there's King Kamehameha I of Hawaii, who in a moment of sheer tactical brilliance or cinematic absurdity once used a giant fishing net to catch his enemies, not metaphorically, literally. Known as Kamehameha the Great, this monarch united the Hawaiian Islands through a mix of diplomacy, warfare, and shrewd alliances. He was a formidable warrior and a visionary leader, but also a man deeply connected to the land and sea. So when faced with the challenge of subduing rival chiefs during his campaigns to unify the islands in the late 18th century, Kamehameha did what only a ruler raised in Polynesian martial tradition might do. He used a traditional net meant for catching fish to trap enemy warriors. The story, passed down through Hawaiian oral tradition and recorded by early Western observers, recounts a key battle in which Kamehameha's forces lured a rival faction into a narrow valley. The geography was perfect: steep cliffs, a narrow pass, and plenty of natural choke points. As the rival warriors marched forward, confident in their numbers, Kamehameha's men flanked them not with spears but with an enormous woven net. It was strong, flexible, and large enough to ensnare dozens. Warriors became entangled, unable to move or fight. What followed was not a traditional skirmish, but a logistical collapse of the enemy line. It was one part battle, one part improvisational theatre, and completely devastating for those caught inside. The genius of the tactic lay in its unexpectedness. No army expects to be fished. But for Kamehameha, the net wasn't just a tool, it was a metaphor. Just as the sea provides for those who understand its rhythms, so too does power come to those who know how to harness their environment. It also reflected Kamehameha's broader philosophy of adaptive warfare. He trained his warriors in traditional Hawaiian combat, but also welcomed Western firearms and cannons when they became available. He wasn't tied to pride or tradition, he was tied to results. And the result of that net-wielding strategy? Victory, consolidation, and eventually the unification of the Hawaiian Islands under a single rule, a feat no leader before him had achieved. The net itself has become legend, less as a physical artifact, more as a symbol, a reminder that real power doesn't always arrive on horseback or in steel armor. Sometimes it drifts in on the tide, waiting to be woven. Of course, while Kamehameha was ensnaring enemies like they were dinner, some kings were barely holding onto their crowns, like the monarch whose reign was so short you could have missed it during lunch. King Louis XIX of France technically ruled for only 20 minutes before abdicating. There are short reigns. And then there's King Louis XIX, a monarch whose time on the throne was shorter than the average nap. In fact, unless you were watching the French political news with a stopwatch on the 2nd of July, 1830, you likely missed it entirely, because Louis IX was King of France for just 20 minutes. Yes, 20. Let's rewind. In the summer of 1830, France was a political powder keg. King Charles X, a staunch ultra-royalist, had pushed too far with repressive ordinances, sparking the July Revolution. Riots erupted in Paris. Citizens took to the streets. The Bourbon monarchy, freshly restored after Napoleon's exile, was unraveling yet again. Faced with mounting pressure and zero allies, Charles X agreed to abdicate and passed the crown to his son, the Duke of Angoulême, a.k.a. Louis Antoine, who, upon accepting the abdication, officially became King Louis XI. And then, approximately 20 minutes later, he abdicated too. Why? Likely a mix of fear, futility, and a basic understanding of the mob forming outside. The Bourbon name had become radioactive. Louis XI had no support, no base, no real will to test the Parisian appetite for guillotines a second time. So in the span of one afternoon, France saw two monarchs abdicate and a constitutional monarchy crumble like a dry croissant. Historians have debated whether Louis XIX ever truly ruled. Some argue he never formally accepted the crown. Others point to written documents confirming the brief reign. Legally murky, symbolically ridiculous, a royal reign that lasted less time than it takes to boil pasta. But what's most striking is how incredibly French the entire situation was. A centuries-old dynasty, undone by ideals, revolution, and its own stubborn refusal to modernize, all culminating in a 20-minute monarchy. Louis XI fled into exile with his family, living out his days in obscurity. No portraits were painted of him in regal pose. No laws bear his name. His reign exists primarily as a footnote or a trivia question at particularly niche historical cocktail parties. Yet it encapsulates a peculiar truth about monarchy. The crown is only as heavy as the people let it be, and sometimes it slips off before you've even adjusted the velvet lining. And while Louis XIX's reign could fit neatly into a coffee break, the next king made time for a far longer habit. Smoking to the tune of 200 cigarettes a day, puffed with the regal boredom of a monarch with nothing left to burn but his lungs. King Zog I of Albania smoked about 200 cigarettes a day. Every royal has their vice. Some build palaces, others collect mistresses, manuscripts, or medals. But King Zog I of Albania, monarch, dictator, and walking contradiction, preferred his vice inhaled, one nicotine-soaked puff at a time. By the time he was ousted from the throne in 1939, Zog was reportedly smoking up to 200 cigarettes a day. That's 10 packs. 10. A minute-by-minute exercise in respiratory roulette, performed with the nonchalance of a man who'd already outlasted assassins, foreign invaders, and at least one financial scandal. Born Ahmet Muhtar Zagali, Zog rose to power during the post-Ottoman chaos of the early 20th century. He declared himself king of the Albanians in 1928. Transforming the struggling republic into a monarchy with himself as its glittering, if slightly anxious, centerpiece. His rule was authoritarian, but oddly modern, balancing progressive reforms with ruthless suppression of dissent. And through it all, smoke. Whether in meetings, motorcades, or meandering monologues, Zog chain-smoked his way through history. His fingers were perpetually yellowed. His palace, a foggy cloud of Turkish tobacco and French imports. Advisors joked that you could follow him blindfolded by the smell alone. Why so much smoking? Well, consider the context. Zog survived over 50 assassination attempts, many in broad daylight, some during parliamentary sessions. One infamous incident occurred in 1931 when gunmen opened fire on him outside a Vienna opera house. Zog, ever the dramatist, reportedly drew his own pistol and fired back, James Bond style. So, perhaps the cigarettes weren't just a habit, they were ritual. A steady inhale in a world where bullets were always one rumor away. Or maybe, as some biographers suggest, Zog believed the smoke gave him a sort of cinematic mystique, a blend of Eastern potentate and Western gangster. He lived in exile after the Italian invasion, bouncing between countries, trailing cigarette ash and broken dreams. But even as his power faded, the cigarettes remained. He died in 1961, of natural causes. Not assassination, not war, not coup. Just the quiet surrender of a man who had burned the candle and everything else at both ends. Zog's legacy today is complex, part tyrant, part reformer, part eccentric. But his nicotine habit? That was pure royal absurdity. Next, a prince so bafflingly revered in a distant land, he somehow became a god to a tribe halfway across the world. Prince Philip of Britain was worshipped as a god by a tribe in Vanuatu. In the grand theatre of royalty, few roles have taken as unexpected a turn as that of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh consort to Queen Elizabeth II, occasional foot-and-mouth gaff machine, and, In one tiny South Pacific village, a literal god. Yes, a god. This peculiar twist in colonial mythology unfolded on the island of Tanna, part of the nation of Vanuatu, where the Yaonanan tribe began revering Prince Philip in the mid-20th century as a divine figure, not metaphorically, not as an honorary title, but in the full spiritual sense. According to their belief, Philip was a pale-skinned son of an ancient mountain spirit, destined to travel far away, marry a powerful woman, and return with blessings. This belief didn't arise from Buckingham Palace propaganda or missionary tales. It was born from a fusion of traditional Melanesian prophecy, British imperial presence, and a little bit of colonial surrealism. When the villagers saw portraits of Queen Elizabeth II, with Philip often pictured beside her, and learned he was her husband, it clicked. The man in the photo wasn't just some foreign royal. He was the one foretold. Word spread. The villagers began holding rituals in his honor. They displayed his photographs in shrines. They sent him ceremonial gifts, most famously a traditional pig-killing club. In return, Philip sent back a photo of himself holding the club, dressed in a suit, looking mildly confused but also dutiful. It was, in that moment, possibly the most polite divine acknowledgement ever recorded. The prince was reportedly amused by the whole thing. Courtiers, predictably, were baffled, but anthropologists saw something more profound. In the aftermath of colonial rule, tribal communities often repurposed the symbols of their former rulers into something new, local, and sacred. This wasn't naivety, it was adaptation. And so the worship continued. Year after year, the prince remained a fixture in village mythology. When he passed away in 2021, the tribe mourned him with ceremonies and songs. They held a sacred gathering to commemorate his spirit and reaffirm their belief that he would return in spiritual form to bring peace and abundance. What's remarkable isn't the eccentricity of this belief, but how seriously it was treated not just by the villagers, but by the royal family. No mocking press release, no dismissive statements, just quiet acknowledgement. A tacit understanding that sometimes, even in the global chess game of monarchy, the board flips. And if Prince Philip's celestial career was unexpected, the next emperor's reign was somehow more surreal. A man who ruled a country that didn't exist and printed his own money anyway. Emperor Norton I of the United States, self-declared, issued his own currency, which locals happily accepted. In the mid-19th century, while gold rush chaos reigned in California and real emperors ruled elsewhere with swords and armies, Joshua Abraham Norton walked into the streets of San Francisco and declared himself Norton I, Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico. Nobody stopped him, and thus began one of history's most absurd, heartwarming, and strangely functional reigns, a man with no throne, no army, and no legal power, who nonetheless became a beloved figurehead in a city that had no king but desperately needed a little whimsy. Norton wasn't born mad. He was once a successful businessman who fell into ruin after a bad deal involving rice imports. Bankruptcy followed, reputation shattered. But instead of retreating into despair, he leaned into something else entirely narrative. He re-emerged, not as a failed investor, but as an emperor, complete with proclamations, uniforms, and royal flair. He issued imperial decrees, ordering the dissolution of Congress. No one listened. Demanding a suspension bridge be built between Oakland and San Francisco. This one actually happened decades later. And declaring protections for all minority groups in the empire, San Francisco, to its credit, mostly obliged. But perhaps most bizarrely, Emperor Norton printed his own currency bonds and notes bearing his royal seal, redeemable on demand in the year 1880. Local restaurants, shops, and theatres accepted them, not as legal tender, but as souvenirs, as endorsements of his charming delusion, as a city-wide inside joke that, somehow, never turned cruel. He dined in restaurants for free, rode public transport without charge, theatres reserved seats for him. He inspected infrastructure projects with the seriousness of a real sovereign. And when he walked the streets in his patched-up uniform, top hat, and cane, people bowed. He was protected, adored, and even in some strange civic sense, respected. Newspapers published his proclamations. The police once arrested him for vagrancy, but public outrage led to an apology and a formal edict from the police chief ordering officers to salute Emperor Norton on sight. When he died in 1880, over 10,000 people attended his funeral. Businesses closed. Obituaries hailed him as a beloved eccentric. He was buried with honors. San Francisco, in all its chaos, mourned its self-declared emperor more sincerely than it ever mourned some of its actual mayors. And in a way, Norton's reign raises an unsettlingly profound question. If people believe in a ruler and behave accordingly, isn't that on some level real power? Of course, not every ruler earned reverence through charm. Some preferred sneakiness, like the king who once stole Winston Churchill's pocket watch during a diplomatic dinner. King Farouk of Egypt once stole a pocket watch from Winston Churchill during a dinner. Among 20th century monarchs, King Farouk of Egypt stands out not for wisdom, reform, or military acumen, but for being a flamboyant kleptomaniac with a taste for mischief, known for everything from compulsive eating to luxury hoarding to petty theft. The most infamous case? The night he stole Winston Churchill's pocket watch. Yes, that Churchill. During a formal diplomatic dinner, the scene reads like a slow-burn heist film written by Oscar Wilde. Churchill, always the statesman, placed his watch on the table, perhaps a nervous tic, perhaps a subconscious assertion of control over time itself. Farouk, ever the opportunist, noticed it, admired it, and quietly pocketed it. Churchill realized it was missing and began searching. The other guests noticed. A quiet panic set in. Nobody said anything directly, because accusing a king of theft, especially in front of other dignitaries, is a diplomatic minefield. But according to the story, Farouk later returned the watch privately, grinning, offering no apology, just that mischievous charm that made people unsure whether to laugh or gasp. And this wasn't a one-off. Farouk was known for his obsessive collecting, bordering on compulsion. Coins, watches, Fabergé, eggs, rare stamps, luxury cars. His personal stash rivaled that of small museums. He once claimed to own every important coin in the world. He hoarded food, toys, clothes, and yes, more watches. He also loved playing pranks, sometimes benign, sometimes bizarre. He'd switch place cards at banquets, hide items in guests' coats, or impersonate staff for laughs. For Farouk, monarchy wasn't just governance, it was performance art, driven by impulse and indulgence. But behind the antics was a kingdom sliding into crisis. Farouk's rule was marked by corruption, political unrest, and eventual military coup. In 1952, he was forced to abdicate and flee Egypt. The monarchy was abolished shortly after. Still, even in exile, Farouk remained Farouk. He lived lavishly in Rome, dined in luxury, and continued collecting, though presumably not from Churchill's table. He died young after a particularly indulgent meal, a man who lived as if reality were a suggestion, and consequences always a day late. His life reminds us that not all royalty is regal. Some are just rich children in adult bodies, given a nation to mismanage and a dining room full of silverware to borrow. And if you thought that was embarrassing, wait till you meet the king who accidentally starred in Spain's first X-rated film by way of a leaked private collection. King Alfonso XIII of Spain appeared in the first X-rated film in Spain by accident, when his private porn collection leaked. When most people think of royalty and cinema, they imagine ceremonial openings of film festivals, ribbon cutting at cultural institutions, and maybe a monarch awkwardly clapping during an arts grant announcement. King Alfonso XIII of Spain, however, managed to get entangled in cinematic history in a very different and thoroughly unintended way. Let's start at the top. Alfonso XIII reigned from birth in 1886, becoming the constitutional monarch of Spain during one of the most politically chaotic periods in the country's modern history. By the early 20th century, he was juggling military disasters, rising republicanism, anarchist movements, and a press corps that grew bolder by the headline. But amid all this turbulence, Alfonso found time for an unexpected side project. He quietly commissioned erotic films. Now, let's be clear, he didn't star in these films. He wasn't directing, acting, or operating a camera. But he did, according to multiple historians, personally fund the production of several early pornographic short films in Spain. Not for art, not for science, just because he could. The project was secret. The films were never intended for public viewing. They were shot in private with pseudonymous actors and stored discreetly in royal archives or private estates. Alfonso reportedly had a fascination with early cinema and saw the medium's potential not just as a storytelling platform, but as a highly customized entertainment experience. The titles were cheeky, the plots flimsy, the production values about what you'd expect from a 1,910-second stag film made on royal funding. But it's what happened after his abdication that launched Alfonso into infamy. In 1931, the king fled Spain following widespread political unrest and the establishment of the Second Republic. With him went his belongings, but not all of them. Some of the films he had privately commissioned were left behind or transferred to confidants. Over time, they leaked. Archivists, historians, and eventually journalists uncovered their origin. The connection was made. Alfonso XIII, Spain's once dignified monarch, had unintentionally become the executive producer of Spain's first known X-rated film library. The fallout? Well, Alfonso was already in exile, disgraced for political, not cinematic, reasons. But the revelation added a strange, almost slapstick postscript to his legacy. For a king who spent his reign walking the tightrope between tradition and modernity, the fact that he ended up associated with risque celluloid reels feels darkly poetic, a monarch dethroned not by revolution alone, but by forgotten reels and poor filing decisions. The story raises a fascinating question. Can one accidentally make film history? Alfonso did. Not by standing on set, but by funding shadows and forgetting where he left them. And if Alfonso's legacy was wrapped in film reels and scandal, the next king's legacy was far more architectural, involving mistresses, Versailles, and a suspiciously well-groomed deer park that had nothing to do with deer. King Louis XV of France kept a secret deer park at Versailles filled with mistresses disguised as shepherdesses. When most people picture Versailles, they think of golden gates, manicured gardens, and aristocratic excess coated in Rococo charm. But tucked away within the grand sprawl of that gilded palace was a more curious creation, one that combined pastoral fantasy, royal libido, and theatrical misdirection. It was called Parc aux Cerfs, or the Deer Park, but make no mistake, there were no deer. Only young women. Hand-selected, Veiled in secrecy and cloaked in euphemism, these women were brought to a discreet section of the palace grounds, where they were housed, pampered, and occasionally costumed as shepherdesses, all under the quiet supervision of the king's valet and a shadowy network of intermediaries. Their real role? To serve as private companions to King Louis XV and to help him maintain the illusion of gentlemanly distance from the chaos of court. It was Versailles, after all. Appearances mattered. Louis XV, known as Louis the Beloved early in his reign, eventually became more accurately remembered as Louis the Indulgent. By the time he established the Deer Park in the mid-18th century, his political power was waning, the economy faltering, and public sentiment souring. But inside his carefully curated bubble of faux pastoral bliss, the king was living in a kind of pre-Netflix escapist fantasy, complete with silk ribbons and powdered wigs. Each shepherdess had her own apartment. They were given expensive gifts, fine clothing, and often pensions upon leaving. It wasn't exactly imprisonment, but neither was it autonomy. Many of the women were barely teenagers when first brought in, and they entered a world where the lines between fantasy, flattery, and obligation blurred into velvet wallpaper. And the irony? Louis XV thought this setup made him more discreet. Unlike his grandfather Louis XIV, whose mistresses were displayed publicly like state ministers, Louis XV kept his Deer Park quiet, tucked away, sanitized with euphemism. But Versailles had ears. Rumors leaked, satirical pamphlets circulated, and by the time Louis XV was an old man, the image of the once beloved king had morphed into that of a faded libertine, surrounded not by power, but by perfume and pretense. His mistresses had become metaphors for his detachment, his opulence, and his inability to adapt. The Deer Park was eventually shut down, but its legend endured as a symbol of a monarchy increasingly out of touch, wrapped in costume dramas while the nation's mood darkened. And with that, we come to the end of a royal parade of ridiculousness. From glass-bodied kings and hot chocolate emperors to net-wielding warriors and ink-drinking sovereigns, one thing becomes clear. Monarchy isn't just power, it's performance. And sometimes the most absurd acts leave the most unforgettable legacies.